The nursing home smelled like bleach and surrender. Margaret Ellison sat by the third-floor window of Sunset Meadows Care Facility, watching the autumn wind strip leaves from the oak tree outside. 81 years old, 98 pounds, and forgotten by nearly everyone who had once promised to remember her. Her hands, veined and trembling, rested in her lap over a thin blue blanket she had brought from home 11 weeks ago. Home. The word tasted like something stolen. 11 weeks. 3 days. 7 hours. She had been counting since the morning her son David and his wife Patricia had driven her here under the pretense of a brunch that never happened. Patricia had patted her knee in the car, using that voice people reserve for small children and frightened animals. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. The house is too much. The stairs are too much. You're too much." Those last words hadn't been spoken aloud, but Margaret had heard them anyway. The truth Margaret had not allowed herself to say aloud even once in 11 weeks was that David and Patricia had needed her gone. The farmhouse in Cedar Hollow, the one Margaret and her husband Harold had bought in 1967 with every dollar they had saved from his mechanic's wages and her seamstress work, sat on 41 acres of Ohio farmland that a developer had been eyeing for 3 years. David had mentioned the offer exactly once over Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. Margaret had said no. 6 months later, he had started worrying aloud about her memory, her balance, the way she sometimes forgot where she had set her reading glasses. Patricia had begun calling 3 times a week, asking pointed questions about what Margaret had eaten, whether she had remembered to take her blood pressure pill. And then one Sunday in August, they had come for brunch that turned into a drive, and the drive turned into a building with a keypad lock, and the keypad lock turned into a small room with a window that did not open. A nurse named Dawn moved down the hallway, pushing a rattling cart of paper cups and pills. Margaret could hear her cooing at Mr. Henderson across the way, the man who had been a decorated fighter pilot and now wept when he could not find the television remote. Margaret pressed her lips together until they disappeared. She would not become Mr. Henderson. She would not become the woman in room 217 who had stopped recognizing her own children. She would not become any of these gentle, diminished ghosts who had been deposited here by families who visited on holidays and signed checks the rest of the year. She had a plan. She had been making it for 11 weeks and 3 days. The plan had started the afternoon she realized that the front desk clerk, a tired-looking young woman named Brittany, left her station unattended for exactly 7 minutes every afternoon at 2:15 to smoke a cigarette behind the kitchen dumpster. Margaret knew this because Margaret had watched. She had also watched the delivery van that arrived every Tuesday and Friday at 2:20 with linens. She had watched how the side door near the laundry stayed propped open during those deliveries with a small red brick. She had watched everything, and she had written nothing down because her mind, despite what David and Patricia claimed, still worked perfectly well. Margaret also had something else, something David and Patricia did not know about, because Harold had kept it a secret for nearly 60 years, and she had kept it a secret for the 13 years since his death. Something that lived in a rusted coffee can buried beneath the floorboards of the old barn at the back of her property, the barn that David had pronounced condemned and a liability and 3 stiff breezes away from collapse. The barn. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself see it the way it had been in 1968, when Harold had first led her out across the tall grass to show her what he called his thinking place. 84 years old, built by a German immigrant named Otto Kaufmann, who had worked as a master woodworker before the Great Depression had swallowed his savings. Otto had built the barn with dovetail joints and tongue-in-groove paneling. Harold had loved that barn. In the early years of their marriage, when the grief of 3 miscarriages had settled over their little house like a low fog, Harold had gone out to that barn to work with his hands, and sometimes Margaret had followed, and they had sat together on a bale of straw in the hayloft, and not said anything at all, and it had been enough. Harold had died of a stroke in 2012. Margaret had not been ready, but in the months after, sorting through his papers, she had found a letter. She had found what Harold had hidden in the barn, and she had done nothing with it. For 13 years she had done nothing with it, because Harold's dying wish, written in that shaky hand during the last month of his life, had been that she tell no one. Not their son, not their grandchildren, not even the lawyer. He had written, in his careful mechanic's printing, that the thing in the barn was hers alone and that she would know when the time was right. The time Margaret decided on her 11 weeks and third day in Sunset Meadows was now. She waited until 2:14. She rose from her chair, steadier than she had let anyone see in months. She had been practicing her shuffling walk for weeks, letting the staff think her legs were failing. It was not progressing. Margaret walked 4 laps of her small room every night after the last bed check at 11. She did wall push-ups against the bathroom door. Her legs were not what they had been at 50, but they were not finished. She wore the long gray cardigan she had arrived in, the one that made her look like every other woman in this building. She clipped her thin white hair back with 2 bobby pins. She picked up the canvas tote bag printed with the words Farmers Market Cedar Hollow, and she slipped into it the things she had gathered over 11 weeks. Her reading glasses, her wallet, which David had not thought to confiscate because he had not believed she could still use it, the small leather folder with her Social Security card, her expired driver's license, and a single photograph of Harold standing beside the barn. And the thing she had hidden inside her pillowcase, the thing that had come in the mail 2 weeks ago in a manila envelope addressed to her in careful handwriting, forwarded from her post office box in Cedar Hollow that she had quietly maintained without telling anyone. She walked into the hallway at 2:15 and turned left toward the laundry room instead of right toward the common area. She kept her head down. Another resident passed her going the other way, a woman named Ruth who had taught high school English for 40 years and now recited Robert Frost to the walls. Ruth looked at Margaret and said nothing. Ruth saw everything and said nothing. That was one of the things Margaret had learned in 11 weeks. The red brick was in the doorway. The delivery van was parked in the loading bay, its back doors open, 2 men in blue coveralls unloading bundled towels. Neither looked up. Margaret walked past them, past the dumpster, past the chain-link fence with its cheerful sign declaring Sunset Meadows, a better tomorrow, and onto the cracked sidewalk of Elm Avenue. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked, and she turned the corner at the end of the block, and she kept walking. 2 blocks down, at the bus stop outside the Walgreens, Margaret sat on the metal bench and allowed herself to breathe for the first time in what felt like an hour. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her eyelids. She touched the photograph of Harold in her wallet. She whispered something to him. Then she counted the bills she had been hoarding for weeks, the small amounts Patricia had left behind on visits when she thought Margaret could no longer count. $43. Enough for a bus to the Greyhound station. Enough for a ticket to Cedar Hollow, 2 hours south. Enough. The envelope in her bag rustled when she set the tote on her lap. She did not pull it out. She did not need to. She knew what was inside. A letter from a young woman named Beverly Chun, a graduate student at Ohio State University's history department. Beverly had been researching local German immigrants of the early 20th century, and she had become fascinated by one Otto Kaufmann, whose property records had placed him at the address of a small farm in Cedar Hollow from 1902 until his disappearance in 1934. Otto Kaufmann, Beverly had written, was believed to have been the custodian of a collection of objects smuggled out of Europe in the years before the First World War. Objects that had belonged, according to the oral histories Beverly had gathered from Kaufmann's descendants in Dusseldorf, to the Kaufmann family for 6 generations. Objects, Beverly had written carefully in her letter, that had included cultural and historical items of exceptional significance. If Mrs. Ellison would be willing to speak with her, at her convenience, Beverly would consider it an honor. Margaret had read the letter 4 times the night it arrived. Then she had slid it into her pillowcase and she had begun counting the days until she could get home. The bus came. She got on it. She paid her fare. She sat by the window and watched the tired brick buildings of Columbus give way to the highway and the flat October fields of central Ohio. Somewhere behind her, at Sunset Meadows, Brittany was returning to her station and glancing at the hallway, and assuming that Mrs. Ellison in room 214 was still sitting by her window, the way she always did. Dawn was pushing her cart toward the West Wing. David was at his office in Cleveland, where he worked as an insurance adjuster. Patricia was at her weekly hair appointment. None of them knew. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. It was the first one in 11 weeks. The Greyhound from Columbus to Cedar Hollow cost $31 and took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Margaret slept for some of it, a fitful, shallow sleep, and when she woke the bus was pulling into the gas station parking lot that served as Cedar Hollow's transit hub. The town had not grown in her absence. It had not grown in 20 years. Population 3,847, according to the sign by the water tower, although Margaret suspected it was lower than that now. The young people left. The old people died or were taken away by children who could not be bothered to drive back for visits. Margaret climbed down the bus steps with one hand on the rail. The driver, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, watched her and said, "You got someone meeting you, ma'am?" Margaret told him yes, which was not precisely true, and she walked across the parking lot toward the pay phone that, miraculously, still stood outside the Sunoco station. She fed it 4 quarters and dialed a number she had memorized 40 years ago. "Hoffman Automotive," said the voice on the other end, and Margaret almost wept. "Sam," she said. "It's Margaret Ellison." There was a long silence. Then Sam Hoffman said, "Margaret, sweet Lord, where are you? They told me you were in Columbus." "I was," she said. "I'm not anymore. I'm at the Sunoco on Route 4. I need a ride to the farmhouse. Can you come?" "I'm leaving right now," Sam said, and he hung up. Sam Hoffman had been Harold's best friend for 51 years. They had opened a garage together in 1974, dissolved the partnership amicably in 1991 when Harold wanted to focus on his own work, and stayed close until the day Harold died. Sam was 79 now, still ran the garage, still had the same grease under his fingernails he had been cultivating since he was 16. When he pulled up in his green pickup truck 20 minutes later, Margaret saw his face through the windshield, and Sam's jaw was set in a hard line that she recognized. Sam was angry. Sam had been angry for a long time, and Margaret had a feeling she was about to find out just how angry. He climbed out and folded her into a hug that smelled like motor oil and aftershave. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "They wouldn't let me see you," he said. "I drove up there 3 times. David told me you weren't accepting visitors. Told me the doctor said I'd upset you. I knew it was a load of horse manure, Margaret, but I didn't know what to do." "There was nothing you could do," Margaret said. "Sam, can we go? They'll notice I'm gone in another hour, and David's the emergency contact." Sam helped her into the truck. He drove them out of the Sunoco lot and onto the Tulane County road that cut through the cornfields toward her farmhouse, and he did not ask her any questions for the first 3 miles, which was exactly what she needed. When he finally spoke, it was to say, "The house is empty. They had a realtor out there last week. Sign in the yard. They were going to put it on the market in 2 weeks." Margaret closed her eyes. "How much for?" "420. Developer named Lal Benton's been driving by every couple of days. I heard he offered David $500 if David would take the sign down and sell direct. They were going to bulldoze it. The whole property. Houses, barn, everything. Benton's been buying up farmland between here and Marysville for 2 years. Wants to put in one of those developments with the little fake downtowns." Margaret watched the corn go by. Patricia drove down last month with a moving truck. They cleaned out the house. Took everything to a storage unit over in Delaware, I think, or just threw it. I tried to stop them. David told me to mind my business. But Margaret, the barn's still there. Nobody's touched it. Building inspector came out 3 weeks ago to red tag it, but he's a friend of mine, name's Curtis. He told me he walked through it and said it was structurally fine. Leaky roof, loose board or two, nothing that would collapse. He told David. David told him to red tag it. Anyway, said it would bring the sale price up if they could demolish it. Curtis did it, but he didn't like it. Margaret thought about this. She thought about her son, the little boy she had taught to tie his shoes, the young man who had cried at his father's funeral, the middle-aged stranger who had shipped his mother off to a facility and then sold off her belongings before the body was even cold, as Harold would have said. "Sam," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not say anything until I'm done." "Okay. I'm going to buy back my own property. I'm going to go to the tax office tomorrow and see if there's any way to contest what David's done. If there isn't, I'm going to find another way. And I need your help with the barn." "Anything." Harold left something in that barn, Sam. Something he never told anyone about. Not even me. Not really. Not until after he was gone. I've known about it for 13 years, and I've never done anything with it. But now, I think, the time has come. Sam drove for a while without speaking. The truck's tires hummed on the asphalt. The sun was beginning to slant toward the western horizon, turning the tops of the corn into long brass lines. "Whatever you need," Sam said finally. "I'm in." They turned onto Ellison Road, the gravel lane that had been named for Harold's grandfather in 1923, and the farmhouse came into view at the end of the drive. Margaret felt the first real tears come. The house looked the same. White clapboard, dark green shutters, the wraparound porch with the swing that Harold had built in 1982. The yard was unmowed. The flower beds she had tended for 57 years were full of weeds. And in the front yard, stabbed into the grass like a small, efficient insult, was a real estate sign. Nelson and Waters Realty. For sale. Keep driving, Margaret said. Around the back. Sam drove around the house and down the long rutted lane that led to the barn. And there it was, still standing, still quiet, its old wood weathered to a soft silver. The tin roof, patched a dozen times in Harold's lifetime, was streaked with rust but holding. The big double doors were closed and padlocked, and the padlock was new. Margaret recognized David's work. Her son had put a padlock on her own barn. "I don't have a key," she said. Sam reached behind his seat and pulled out a bolt cutter. "I came prepared." He cut the padlock in 3 seconds. The chain fell to the ground. Margaret stepped forward and pulled open the heavy left door, and the air inside the barn came rolling out to meet her, smelling of hay and old wood and Harold. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and she did not stop her tears because there was no one left to hide them from. The interior was exactly as Harold had left it. His workbench along the far wall, the pegboard of tools above it. The old tractor that had not run since 1998, but that he had refused to sell because he had said he would get to it. The hayloft ladder. The cedar smell of it, even after all these years. Margaret walked slowly across the dirt floor, her canvas tote bag swinging against her hip, and she stopped at the workbench and touched the surface with her fingertips. "Where?" Sam said softly. "Under the floor," Margaret said. "The third board from the left, under the bench. Harold cut it short in 1970. He told me he was reinforcing the subfloor. He lied. Bring that crowbar." Sam found the crowbar and wedged it under the board. It came up easily, as if it had been designed to, which of course it had. Beneath the board was a small recess in the packed earth, and in the recess was the rusted coffee can Margaret had seen exactly twice. Once in 2012 and once in 2013, when she had come out here on the anniversary of Harold's death to see if it was still real. She knelt slowly, her knees protesting, and Sam helped her. She lifted the can out of the earth. It was heavier than she remembered. She set it on the workbench and pried off the rusted plastic lid, and inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, was what Harold had hidden in 1970 and what he had never told anyone about until the letter he had left for her to find after his death. Margaret unwrapped the oilcloth slowly. Sam stood beside her, not breathing. Inside the oilcloth were papers. Old papers, stiff with age. A leather-bound journal. A ring of keys. And something else, something small, wrapped in red velvet that had faded to the color of dried blood. Margaret lifted out the papers first. They were in German, most of them, with a few in English. She could not read German, but she did not need to, because Harold had written her a translation on yellow legal paper and tucked it behind the originals. She had read it 13 years ago, and she remembered every word. "Sam," she said, "do you remember Otto Kaufmann?" Sam frowned. "The fellow who built the barn. I don't remember him. My dad used to talk about him. Said he disappeared in the 30s. Folks thought he went back to Germany." "He didn't go back to Germany. He couldn't. Otto Kaufmann was not a woodworker by trade, Sam. He was a curator. He worked for a private collection in Berlin in the late 1890s, and when he came to America in 1902, he brought things with him. Things that belonged to families that paid him to save them. Things that, if they had stayed in Europe, would not have survived the 2 wars that came after." Sam's eyes moved slowly from Margaret to the papers to the small red velvet bundle. In 1934, Otto got word that people were looking for him. German agents. They thought he had stolen from the Reich. He hadn't. He had saved things that belonged to Jewish families and Catholic families and ordinary German families who had paid him to hide them. But the new government in Germany did not care about the truth. Otto knew they would come for him. So he walked into the woods behind this barn on the night of November 14th, 1934, and he never came back. The sheriff at the time ruled it a suicide. Harold's grandfather, who was living on this land then, believed Otto had gone into hiding. Harold's grandfather found these things in the barn in 1938, after the deed had passed to the Ellison family through tax forfeiture. He did not know what they were. He assumed they were Otto's personal effects. He left them where he found them. Margaret opened the leather journal. Pressed between some of the pages were thin papers with faded ink, and on some of those papers, drawings. sketches, and attached to some of the papers were small tags, hand-labeled with dates and names, and what Margaret had eventually come to understand were catalog numbers. Harold found these papers in 1969. He was 32 years old. He was replacing a floorboard in the barn because I had complained it was rotting. He found the coffee can. He read the papers. He did not understand most of them, but he understood enough. He understood that this barn was sitting on top of something that could change our lives, and that if he told anyone, the wrong people would come and take it away. He talked to his father before his father died. They agreed to leave it. Why? Margaret picked up the red velvet bundle. It was small, no larger than her fist. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small silver reliquary, intricately engraved, perhaps 6 inches tall. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that no one did anymore. And set into the front of the reliquary, catching the fading light from the barn doors, was a single clear stone that Margaret knew, from her 13 years of quiet, patient study, was a diamond of approximately 4 carats. Because, Margaret said, they thought the rightful owners might still be alive, or their children, or their grandchildren. Harold did not want blood money, Sam. He did not want to sell stolen art for profit. He wanted to find the families, but he did not know how. And every year that passed, the task got harder, and he got older, and then he died before he could figure it out. 13 years ago, I found the letter he left me. He told me about this, and he told me he was sorry he had not been braver. He told me to do what he could not. And you didn't. I didn't. Because I was scared, Sam. I was 70 years old, and my husband had just died, and I did not have the strength to take on something this big. I put it back under the floor, and I told myself that if the time came when I needed it, I would use it. And now I need it. Sam looked at the reliquary. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the barn around them. The barn Otto Kaufmann had built with his own hands. Every dovetail joined a small monument to a man who had saved what he could save and who had died alone in the woods rather than let the worst people in the world get what they wanted. What is all of this worth? Sam said softly. Margaret pulled Beverly Chin's letter out of her canvas tote. She read Sam the relevant paragraphs. She watched his face change. Beverly Chin wrote that she has been in contact with the Kaufmann family in Germany and with the Dusseldorf Museum of Cultural Heritage. They have records of what Otto was carrying when he left Europe in 1902. They have photographs of some of the pieces. They have documentation of the families who entrusted their belongings to him. Those families, Sam, most of them died in the camps. But there are descendants. There are institutions. There are people who have been looking for some of these things for 80 years. Margaret paused. She touched the reliquary with one finger. And there is also this. This was not part of the Kaufmann family collection. This was something Otto himself owned. It is mentioned in the journal, Beverly tells me in her letter. Otto was entrusted with it in 1912 by a family in Cologne. It is a 12th century reliquary, Sam. Gothic work. The cathedral it came from was destroyed in the war. The family that owned it was murdered. There are no direct heirs. Beverly believes, based on her research, that the Catholic Church has standing to claim it, but that it could also be acquired by a private buyer at auction. A piece like this, in this condition, with this provenance, she estimates, at a minimum, for $100,000. A major museum might pay $700,000 or $800,000. Sam did not say anything. That is just one piece, Sam. There are, in the catalog Harold compiled before he died, over 140 items documented in this journal. Paintings, manuscripts, a small bronze, silver, gold. Not all of them are here. Some were lost. Some Otto must have sold to survive during the Depression. But many are here. They are in the walls, Sam. They are in the hayloft. They are in sealed compartments Otto built into the workbench. Harold spent 20 years, quietly and carefully, locating all of them. His notes are here. Sam sat down on an overturned bucket. He put his head in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. Margaret, he said. How much? In total. What is this worth? Margaret hesitated. Beverly Chin's letter does not say, because she has not seen any of it in person. But Harold wrote an estimate, based on auction comparables in 2010 for similar pieces. He estimated, at the low end, $12 million. At the high end, closer to 20. The reliquary was his favorite piece, and also the most valuable. But there are also a series of medieval manuscripts in one of the hayloft compartments that he thought might exceed $3 million by themselves. He was a mechanic, Sam. He taught himself all of this from library books and trips to the Cleveland Museum of Art. He became an expert in a field that was not his, because he thought he owed it to Otto Kaufmann to understand what Otto had saved. Sam stood up slowly. He walked to the barn door and looked out at the fading light over the cornfield. He was quiet for a long time. "Margaret," he said, "David put a red tag on this barn last week. He got the inspector to condemn it. He was going to have it bulldozed in the next 2 weeks, as part of the sale to Benton." "I know," Margaret said. "Everything in here. Every single thing Harold spent 20 years cataloging. Your son was going to bulldoze it." "Yes." Sam turned around. His face was the color of old iron. "Then we are going to stop him." Margaret smiled, the second real smile of her 11 weeks and 3 days. "Yes, Sam, we are." They locked the barn with a new padlock from Sam's truck. They drove back to Sam's house, a small bungalow on the edge of town where Sam had lived alone since his wife Ruth had passed in 2019. Sam fed Margaret a bowl of beef stew and a piece of cornbread, and Margaret ate more than she had eaten in 3 months. Then Sam made up the guest bedroom, and Margaret slept for 11 hours, the deepest sleep she had slept since August, and when she woke the next morning, she had a plan. The plan had 4 parts, and the first part was this. She had to get the farmhouse back. Legally, quickly, and in a way that David could not undo. She sat at Sam's kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a yellow legal pad, and she began to write down what she remembered. She had given David a general power of attorney in 2015, 6 months after a small stroke that had frightened her and made her grateful to have a competent son who could help with bill paying and correspondence. She had never revoked it. David had used that power of attorney to sign her into Sunset Meadows. He had used it to list the farmhouse. He had used it, she suspected, to do many things she did not yet know about. "Sam," she said, "is Phil Raymond still practicing law?" Phil Raymond had been Harold's attorney for 40 years. He had drafted their wills, handled the tax matters on the property, sorted out a nasty easement dispute in 1993. "He's 83, Sam said. "He's mostly retired. But he still keeps office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today is Thursday. You want me to call him?" "Please." Phil Raymond picked up on the second ring. He listened to Sam explain, and then he listened to Margaret, and when she had finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. "Margaret," Phil said, "you come down to my office right now. I will rearrange my morning." Phil Raymond's office was in the second floor of the old First National Bank building on Main Street, above what was now a florist. His hair was entirely white and his hands shook slightly, but his eyes were clear. He listened to Margaret's account of the past 11 weeks with his fingers steepled under his chin, and when she was finished, he opened his filing cabinet and pulled out folders. "Your will from 1987, he said, spreading the papers out. "The power of attorney from 2015. Margaret, in September of this year, your son David called my office and requested copies of all of these documents. He said you had given him permission. I told him I could not release copies without speaking to you directly. He told me you were incapacitated and could not speak. I told him to send me a physician's affidavit of incapacity. He never sent one. He called me twice after that, demanding the documents. I refused each time." Margaret closed her eyes. "There is no physician's affidavit of incapacity, is there?" Phil said gently. "No. Then the power of attorney is still valid, but only as long as you wish it to be. We can revoke it today, this morning. I will walk the paperwork over to the clerk's office myself. David will lose his legal authority to act on your behalf the moment I file. A listing agreement signed by David under the power of attorney will be voidable once the power is revoked. The house is still yours, Margaret. Legally, it has always been yours." "He will fight me," Margaret said. "He will try to have me declared incompetent. Then we are going to make sure he cannot win. I want you to see a neurologist. Today, if possible. I have a colleague in Columbus, Dr. Elaine Washburn. She will do a full workup. If you are competent, and Margaret, I can already tell you that you are, she will document it. That documentation will be the shield David cannot get through. I need to do something else too." "What?" Margaret drew a breath. "I need to buy a barn." Phil looked at her. "Not my barn. Another barn. A small, condemned barn about 4 miles from my property. It belonged to a man named Earl Pickett. Earl died 2 years ago. His family put the barn and the 3/4 acre it sits on up for auction at the tax office for $9 in unpaid property taxes. Nobody bid. The county took it. I want to buy it back. For $9. Today. Phil frowned. Margaret, I am not going to ask you why. But I have known you for 40 years, and you don't do things without reasons. Is this connected to whatever is going on at your farm? It is connected. Tell me only what I need to know to help you. Margaret nodded slowly. I need a second property. I need a place that is mine, separate from the farm, that David does not know about. I need it because I am going to move items that are at the farm to a location David cannot reach. And I need the purchase under my name alone, and I need the paperwork so airtight that if David finds out, he will not be able to challenge it. Phil looked at his old friend's wife, the woman sitting across from him with her hands folded in her lap and her face as still and composed as stone. I'll drive you to the tax office myself, he said. Margaret paid for the picket barn with a cashier's check for $9 drawn on the emergency account Harold had set up in 1981 at the Cedar Hollow Credit Union, an account David had never known existed because Harold had set it up in Margaret's maiden name. The account contained, after 44 years of small regular deposits and simple interest, a little under $11,000. It was not a fortune. It was enough. The clerk at the tax office, a young man named Jordan, stared at her as if she had asked to buy the moon. Ma'am, he said, this property. I mean, there's a reason nobody wanted it. The barn is falling down. It's on a little strip of land between two drainage ditches. You can't build on it. You can't really do anything with it. That's fine, Margaret said. It's $9. Yes. And you want it? Yes. Jordan looked at Phil Raymond. Phil nodded. Okay, Jordan said. Congratulations, ma'am. You own a barn. Margaret walked out of the tax office with a quitclaim deed in her hand and the first piece of her plan complete. The second piece, Dr. Washburn's cognitive assessment, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The third piece, moving the contents of Harold's barn to the picket barn, would begin tonight. The fourth piece, the final and most important piece, would require Beverly Chun. She sat in Sam's truck in the parking lot of the tax office, and she dialed the number on the letter from her canvas tote bag, and she waited while the phone rang. A young woman's voice answered. Hello, this is Beverly. Beverly, said Margaret Ellison. This is Mrs. Ellison. You wrote me a letter about Otto Kaufmann. I am ready to talk. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Beverly Chun said, in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm, Mrs. Ellison, where are you right now? I will drive to you today. Margaret smiled, the third real smile of her 11 weeks and 3 days. Bring a notebook, she said. Bring two. Beverly Chun arrived in Cedar Hollow at 4 in the afternoon, driving a blue Toyota Corolla that had seen better days. She was 28 years old, small-framed, with black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that slid down her nose when she leaned forward. She was carrying a canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and a tablet computer under one arm, and when Margaret met her at Sam's front door, the young woman stopped and stared at Margaret with an expression that was equal parts awe and professional restraint. Mrs. Ellison, Beverly said, thank you for calling. Come inside, dear. Sam has made coffee. We have a great deal to discuss. They sat at Sam's kitchen table. Beverly unpacked her bag carefully. 2 notebooks, 3 pens, the tablet, a digital recorder. For my records, Beverly said, I want you to understand, before we begin, that anything you tell me is confidential unless you give permission to publish. I am not a representative of anyone who would seek to take anything from you. I am a graduate student. If what you tell me is true, the proper people to contact are specialists at the major auction houses, the Holocaust Claims Conference, and the museums in Germany that have been tracking dislocated cultural property for the past 80 years. I can introduce you to all of them, but I am not them. Margaret liked this young woman. She liked the careful way Beverly spoke, the way she laid her cards on the table. You remind me of my husband, Margaret said. He was careful too. Margaret told her the story. All of it. Harold. The barn. The 1969 discovery of the coffee can. The journal. The 20 years Harold had spent cataloging. Harold's death and the letter and the 13 years she had sat with the weight of what was under her floor. And she told her about David. About Sunset Meadows. About the red tag on the barn and the demolition scheduled for the next 2 weeks. When she was done, Beverly Chun was crying silently into a paper napkin. Mrs. Ellison, Beverly said, I am going to help you. They made lists. They drank more coffee. Sam, who had been sitting quietly in the other room listening, came in and refilled their cups and asked what he could do, and Beverly turned to him with bright eyes and said, "Do you have friends with trucks?" Sam smiled. "I have been in this town for 79 years. I have friends with everything." By 9 o'clock that night, Margaret had a small army. Sam had called 6 people. Each of them had said yes without asking questions. They came to Sam's house after dark, 1 and 2 at a time, and Margaret met them in the kitchen. Curtis Navarro, the building inspector who had reluctantly red-tagged the barn. Clara Mills, who had been Margaret's friend for 50 years and who ran the County Historical Society. Wendell Obie, Sam's longtime mechanic, 60 and quiet, with hands the size of bread loaves. Dolores Pryor, who had worked in the tax office for 35 years and had retired with an encyclopedic knowledge of every property line in the county. Mike Handler, who had been Harold's fishing buddy for decades and who still drove his old grain truck. And the last, the most unexpected, was Imani Baker, mid-40s, the sole full-time reporter at the Cedar Hollow Gazette. "I thought you might want someone taking notes," Sam said to Margaret. "Imani is trustworthy. She will not publish anything without your say-so." Imani looked at Margaret, steady and calm. "I grew up in Cleveland. My grandmother went into a nursing home against her will when I was 15. She died 6 months later of what my family called a broken heart. I have been waiting my entire career for a story like this, Mrs. Ellison. If you'll have me." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." They laid out the plan on Sam's kitchen table, with Beverly Chun leading the technical portions and Sam leading the logistical ones. The first priority was to document what was in the Kaufmann barn before moving anything. Every item had to be photographed in its original location. Beverly would handle the photography using professional cataloging protocols. Every item had to be cross-referenced against Harold's journal and Beverly's own research on the Kaufmann family's 1902 manifest. Curtis would handle structural assessment of the hiding places as the items were removed. Clara would bring acid-free archival boxes. Wendell would handle transport. Mike Handler's grain truck would make the moves at night under a tarp. The second priority was to secure the picket barn. Curtis and Wendell would inspect it that night. They would make whatever emergency repairs were needed to make it dry and lockable. The items from the Kaufmann barn would move to the picket barn in stages over the next 48 hours. From the picket barn, once every item had been documented and cataloged by Beverly, they would move to a secure climate-controlled storage facility in Columbus that Beverly's faculty advisor had a contact at, and from there, over the course of months, to the proper authorities, auction houses, and heirs. The third priority was David. "He is going to come," Margaret said. "He will come tomorrow or the day after. The nursing home will have called him within an hour of my disappearance today. He will be frantic. He will drive down here, and he will expect to find me confused and disoriented. He will bring Patricia. They will try to physically take me back to Columbus. We need to be ready." "What do you need from us?" Clara asked. "I need witnesses," Margaret said. "I need a small crowd of people who can attest to my cognitive state. I need the neurologist's report from Dr. Washburn, which I will have by Tuesday. And I need the sheriff." "Sheriff Waters is a friend of mine," Sam said. "I will call him tomorrow. I need him to understand, very clearly, that if David attempts to remove me against my will or asserts the old power of attorney, that he has no legal standing to do so." "Phil is taking care of the paperwork in the morning," Sam said. "Sheriff Waters will have the revocation in writing before David even gets on the road." Margaret nodded. She looked around the table, at these good people, these Cedar Hollow people, who had dropped everything on a Thursday night to help an old woman save her home. She felt the tears threaten again, but she did not let them fall. There would be time for crying later. There was work to do first. "One more thing," she said. "Beverly, tell them what I told you about the reliquary." Beverly Chin drew a breath. She looked around the table. "There is an object," she said, "in that barn that I have been looking for since the second year of my doctoral studies. I found references to it in 3 separate family archives in Germany. I have read about it in 2 monographs published in the 1960s and 1 museum catalog from 1987. It is a silver reliquary, 12th century, of a type made in the workshops of Cologne for a small number of wealthy patrons, believed to contain the finger bone of a saint, although the relic itself is missing. It was last publicly seen in 1912. It was entrusted to Otto Kaufmann for safekeeping by the Rothenberg family, who were executed at Auschwitz in 1943. The Rothenberg family had no surviving direct heirs. The reliquary is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant pieces of medieval religious silverwork in private hands anywhere in the world. Its value at auction, I am told by specialists, would be somewhere between $600,000 and $1.2 million, depending on the buyer. The table was silent. And it is one piece, Beverly continued, of what Harold Ellison believed, based on his own careful work, to be at least 140 objects still remaining in the barn. I have not yet seen any of them, but I believe him. I believe Mrs. Ellison. I believe that what we are about to do this weekend is one of the most significant private recoveries of displaced European cultural property in the past 50 years. And I believe that the story of how it happened, of how an 81-year-old woman escaped a nursing home and came home to finish what her husband started, is a story that people will remember for a very long time. Mike Handler, the old fishing buddy, cleared his throat. He looked at Margaret. "Margaret," he said, "you're Harold. He talked about you every single time we went out on the lake. He told me, once, that you were the bravest person he had ever met, but that you didn't know it yet. He said he was waiting for the day you figured it out." Margaret looked at her lap. She could not speak. "Looks like he was right," Mike said. "Just took a little longer than he thought." The moving began at 11 o'clock that night. Mike Handler's grain truck, painted a dull green and unremarkable on country roads, pulled up to the Kaufmann barn at 11:15. Sam drove the lead vehicle, a pickup with Curtis and Wendell in the cab and Beverly in the bed with her camera equipment. Clara and Dolores followed in Clara's station wagon, packed with archival boxes and tissue paper and soft white cotton gloves. Margaret rode with Sam. She had insisted on being there. She had insisted, and when she insisted on something, as Harold had known and as Sam was learning, there was no arguing with her. The moon was a bright 3/4, and the October air was cold enough that Margaret could see her breath. Sam unlocked the new padlock. The great doors swung open. Beverly stepped inside with her flashlight and her camera, and she made a small sound, a small involuntary sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a prayer. "My God," she said. "It is real. It is all real." Harold's journal sat on the workbench where Margaret had left it the night before. Beverly opened it with cotton-gloved hands, and she began to read. Her eyes moved back and forth. She turned pages. She made soft sounds of recognition and surprise. After 10 minutes, she looked up at Margaret. "Your husband," she said, "taught himself everything. This catalog is as good as anything a trained conservator would produce. Better than some. He has provenance notes I did not have. He has identifications I had been guessing at. Mrs. Ellison, your husband was extraordinary." "Yes," Margaret said. "He was." They began the work. Beverly photographed each hiding place before Curtis and Wendell opened it. Some of the places Margaret had known about. The hayloft had 4 sealed compartments behind the old straw bales. The workbench had 3 drawers within drawers, cleverly hidden behind false backs. The south wall had a cavity between the interior and exterior paneling that ran the full length of the barn, accessible only through a small door disguised as a tool rack. Harold had found them all. Harold had mapped them all. Harold had left her a guide. And inside the compartments, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in tin boxes against moisture and vermin, were things. A small oil painting of a woman in a blue dress, Flemish, perhaps late 17th century, likely by a minor master of the school of Franz Hals. Beverly estimated it, at a glance, at $40,000 to $60,000. There were 11 paintings in all. An illuminated manuscript, bound in worked leather, its vellum pages still supple. Beverly held it with both hands, as if it were a living thing. A book of hours, produced in a Flemish workshop around 1450, in a condition she had never personally seen outside of a museum. Value at an estimate, $300,000. There were 4 manuscripts of comparable significance. Silver candlesticks, a silver ewer, a gold chalice that weighed heavier than it should have, each piece wrapped separately, each piece with a tag in Otto Kaufmann's spidery hand noting the year and the family and the city. Augsburg, 1688. Nuremberg, 1712. The Salomon family. The Weiss family. The Grimberg family. Families that had ceased to exist in the 1940s. Their names recorded now only on these small yellowed tags, and in the careful handwriting of the man who had saved what he could save. And the reliquary. Beverly held it for a long time, turning it gently under the flashlight, reading the engraved inscription around the base. When she set it down in the archival box she had prepared, her hands were shaking. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "what you are doing tonight. This is not just a recovery. This is a restoration. Every piece we return to its rightful heirs or to museums. Every one of those pieces represents a family that was destroyed, or a community that was scattered, or a history that was supposed to be erased. And your husband, and his grandfather, and Otto Kaufmann, they refused to let the erasure be complete. They passed the memory forward. And now you are passing it forward." Margaret sat down on the old bench Harold had built in 1971. She did not say anything for a while. Finally, she said, "Beverly, would you hand me the reliquary, please? Just for a moment." Beverly brought the reliquary over in its archival box. Margaret lifted it out with both hands. It was cold silver in time. She held it up so that the single clear stone at its center caught the light from Curtis's flashlight, and the stone threw back a fragment of white fire that briefly filled the dark barn like a small, steady star. "Harold," Margaret whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "We're almost there. We're almost home." The work went on until nearly 4 in the morning. They did not finish. They had known they would not finish. Harold's catalog listed 143 items, and they had located and photographed and packed, by the time Margaret could no longer keep her eyes open, perhaps 30 of them. Mike Handler's grain truck, its cargo space transformed into a rolling archive, made its first run to the picket barn at 2 in the morning, with Wendell driving and Curtis riding guard. They returned at 3, and the second load began. Margaret fell asleep in Sam's passenger seat sometime around 4. She did not remember the drive home. She woke up in Sam's guest bedroom, the same bed she had slept in the night before, with morning sunlight coming through the white curtains and the smell of bacon drifting up from the kitchen below. She lay for a moment with her hands folded on the quilt, listening to her own heart beat. She thought about the reliquary. She thought about Otto Kaufmann walking into the woods in November of 1934. She thought about Harold's hands, in 1969, lifting a floorboard and finding a rusted coffee can. She thought about her son David, who would by now have received his second and third call from Sunset Meadows, who would by now have begun to drive. She got out of bed. She washed her face. She went downstairs to eat bacon and eggs and to prepare herself for what was coming. It was Friday morning, October 24th. Margaret Ellison had been free for approximately 22 hours. In that time, she had revoked a power of attorney, bought a barn for $9, hired a lawyer, retained a cognitive neurologist, gathered an army of 6 friends and 1 graduate student, and moved approximately 30 priceless works of displaced European cultural property out of a condemned barn and into a different condemned barn 4 miles away. And she was just getting started. The phone rang while she was on her second cup of coffee. Sam picked it up in the hallway. He listened for a moment. His face tightened. He handed the receiver to Margaret. "It's David," he said. Margaret took the phone. She held it to her ear. She did not say anything. She let him speak first. "Mom," David said. His voice was tight. "Mom, I know you're there. The home called me yesterday. They said you walked out. I was up half the night calling hospitals. I finally got through to the sheriff down there, and he said you were with Sam. Mom, are you okay? What are you doing?" Margaret took a breath. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about all the versions of this conversation she had rehearsed in the small quiet room at Sunset Meadows. And then she set all of those rehearsed versions aside, because she was 81 years old, and she had been patient for long enough, and it was time for the truth. "David," she said, "I am coming home. I am staying home. I am not going back to Sunset Meadows. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." "Mom, you can't just." "I can, David. And I am. The house is under contract." "No, it isn't. The listing has been voided as of 9 o'clock this morning. My attorney, Phil Raymond, revoked the power of attorney you used to list it. The house is still mine. It has always been mine, and I am moving back into it tonight." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear David breathing. "Mom," he said. Then, more quietly, "Mom, what are you doing? You can't live there alone. You can't take care of yourself. You're 81. "Yes, I am. And I know exactly how old I am, David. I also know exactly what I am doing. I have an appointment on Tuesday with a cognitive neurologist in Columbus. She is going to examine me. She is going to issue a report. That report is going to say that I am perfectly competent to make my own decisions. And when you try to have me declared incompetent, which I believe you will, that report is going to be the first piece of evidence I submit. Do you understand? Mom, do you understand, David? You're not yourself. I am more myself than I have been in 13 years, David. I am myself entirely. And I am telling you that you are not welcome at the farmhouse. If you come down here, I will not open the door. If you bring Patricia, I will not open the door. If you bring a sheriff, you will discover that Sheriff Waters is an old friend of Sam Hoffman, and that he has already been briefed on the situation. Do you understand? Another silence. Then David's voice, different now, angrier. I don't know who has been talking to you, Mom. But whoever it is, they're using you. You know that, right? There are people who prey on elderly women. I am your son. I have been trying to take care of you. No, David. You have been trying to sell my house. Silence. I have known about Lal Benin for 2 years. I know about the offer. I know about the conversation you had with Sam 3 weeks ago when you told him I was incompetent, and I know you told the building inspector to red tag my barn so that you could bulldoze it faster. I know all of it, David. I have known all of it. I am not a confused old woman. I am a very awake one. David did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was different again. Something had cracked. Mom, he said, I'm coming down there. I told you not to. I'm coming down there tonight, Mom. We need to talk. Then talk to my attorney, David. His number is in the phone book. And she hung up. She stood with her hand on the receiver for a long moment. Sam was watching her from the kitchen doorway. You okay? He said. No, Margaret said. But I am going to be. She turned and walked back into the kitchen and picked up her coffee cup. It had gone cold. She did not mind. She drank it anyway. There was work to do. There were hours to count. There was a sun coming, and a barn to empty, and a story not yet finished. Outside, the October wind moved through the big maple in Sam's yard, and a few last red leaves came down in slow circles, and Margaret Ellison, 81 years old and finally, after 11 weeks and 3 days, entirely awake, put down her cold coffee and went to get her canvas bag. David arrived at the farmhouse on Saturday afternoon at 3:17. Margaret knew the time precisely because she had been sitting at the kitchen table watching the clock on the old wall above the stove, the one Harold had hung in 1984 after the previous clock finally gave out. She had been home for nearly 24 hours now. Sam had driven her over on Friday evening after the second night of moving had finished, and Margaret had walked through the rooms of her own house for the first time since August, and she had touched the walls and the window sashes and the banister on the staircase, and she had wept quietly for an hour before she could bring herself to make a cup of tea. Patricia had taken nearly everything. The couch Margaret and Harold had bought in 1978 was gone. The kitchen table with the scratch on the leg where David had carved his initials at age 7 was gone. The china cabinet, the grandfather clock, the rocking chair where Margaret had nursed the son who had just sold her possessions. All of it gone. What remained was a kitchen table Sam had loaned her from his garage, 2 folding chairs, a camping cot with a sleeping bag, and the clock on the wall that Patricia had apparently deemed too ugly to bother with. It was enough. It was more than enough. Margaret had lived in this house for 58 years. The walls remembered her. The floorboards remembered her. She did not need furniture to make it home. David's silver sedan pulled into the driveway and stopped at a careful angle behind Sam's green pickup truck. Sam had insisted on being there. Phil Raymond had insisted on being there. Imani Baker had quietly suggested that she might happen to be there as well, with her notebook, just in case something happened that might need documenting. Curtis Navarro had come by in his inspector's pickup. Dr. Washburn, the neurologist, had driven down from Columbus to hand-deliver a preliminary letter, pending the full evaluation scheduled for Tuesday, stating her professional opinion that Margaret Ellison displayed no observable signs of cognitive impairment. They were all in the kitchen when David arrived. 5 adults with coffee cups. A small, quiet audience. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as David climbed out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the house. He was 56 years old. His hair was almost entirely gray now. He wore a navy blue sport coat over a pale blue shirt, the kind of outfit Patricia had probably picked for him. He walked toward the porch with the slow, heavy steps of a man who did not want to be doing what he was about to do. He did not knock. He had not knocked on this door since he was 19. He simply opened the door and stepped into the mudroom, and he called out, "Mom," and his voice was not the voice of the man who had hung up on her yesterday. It was softer, less certain. Margaret stood up from the kitchen table. "In here, David." He walked through the mudroom and into the kitchen, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw the 5 other people. His eyes moved across them. Phil Raymond, Sam Hoffman, Curtis Navarro, Dr. Washburn, Imani Baker with her notebook and a pen. "Mom," David said. "Who are these people?" "My attorney, my friend, the building inspector, a neurologist from Columbus, and a reporter from the Gazette." "A reporter?" "Yes." David's jaw tightened. He looked at Phil Raymond. "Phil, I have been trying to reach you for 2 days." "I know you have, David," Phil said calmly. "I have been returning your calls as promptly as my schedule allows. I believe I last spoke to you at 9:38 this morning, at which time I informed you that your mother had revoked the power of attorney and that any further legal communications regarding her affairs would need to come through me. You're her attorney. You represent her interests. Her interests include her safety. I represent her interests, David, as she defines them, not as you define them. And right now, her interest is in having a civil conversation with her son in her own home. I am here to facilitate that conversation. I am not here to advocate for you." David looked at his mother. His eyes were red around the edges. He had been crying, Margaret realized, somewhere on the drive down, or perhaps last night. Part of her wanted to go to him and put her hand on his cheek the way she had when he was a little boy. The other part of her, the part that had counted 11 weeks and 3 days, sat very still in her chair. "Mom, can I talk to you alone? Just for a minute?" "No, Mom. You can talk to me here, David, in front of these people. Anything you say to me in private, you can say to me with them listening. That is how this is going to work." David stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. He looked at the cot in the corner, at the folding chairs, at the almost empty house Patricia had stripped. He looked at the clock on the wall. "Mom," he said, "I love you. I know you do not believe me right now, but I love you. And I am scared. I have been scared for a year. The way you were, last winter, when I came over to shovel your driveway, and you had left the stove on all morning. When you called me from the grocery store because you couldn't remember how you had gotten there. When I found the expired milk in the fridge and the bills that had not been paid. Mom, I was not trying to hurt you. I was trying to keep you safe." Margaret looked at her son. She loved him. She had always loved him. That was the difficulty of it, the terrible difficulty of being a mother. The love did not stop. It simply changed shape to accommodate the new geography of the damage. "David," she said, "I am going to tell you the truth. I did leave the stove on that morning. I had taken one of the pills the doctor had prescribed for my back. The pill made me drowsy. I made that mistake. It was a mistake. It was one mistake. When I called you from the grocery store, it was because the parking lot had been repaved and the entrance I always used had been moved to the other side, and I could not find my car for 20 minutes. I was confused. I am 81 years old, David. I get confused sometimes. So do you. So does everyone. That is not dementia. That is being a human being." "Mom, the expired milk was 1 carton of milk. I drink skim. I had bought whole by accident and I did not like it, so I had not finished it. The bills that had not been paid because the automatic payment system at my bank had a glitch in February, which was resolved with 1 phone call. You never asked me about any of these things, David. You never asked. You simply built a case, and then you presented the case to Patricia, and then the 2 of you drove me to Sunset Meadows." David said nothing. "I know about Benton's offer," Margaret said. "I have known since Thanksgiving 2 years ago. You thought I did not hear the conversation you had with Patricia on the porch. I heard every word. I heard you tell her that the house was a tear down and that the land was worth 4 times what the house would sell for. I heard Patricia ask you what we would do about me. I heard you say, 'We will figure that out.'" David closed his eyes. "I am not going to Sunset Meadows, David. I am not going anywhere. I am going to live in this house until I die, and when I die, which will happen on my schedule and God's, and not yours, this house and this land will go to whoever I decide in my will, and not to whoever Patricia has been whispering about. Mom, please, you cannot live here alone." "I can. I will. Sam is next door, 8 minutes away. Clara is 10 minutes away. I have friends in this town, David. I have more friends than you have ever bothered to meet. I am not alone. I have never been alone. You thought I was alone because you had not been here, and you confused your absence with my loneliness." David's face did something then. Something complicated. Margaret had seen that face in him exactly twice before. Once when he was 15 and she had caught him lying about where he had been the night before. Once at Harold's funeral. It was the face of a man being forced to see himself honestly, and it was not a face that anyone enjoyed wearing. Phil Raymond cleared his throat gently. "David," Phil said, "I think this is a good point for me to brief you on the legal situation, so that we are all operating from the same set of facts. The power of attorney your mother granted you in 2015 was formally revoked yesterday at 9:42 in the morning. The listing agreement for this property was voided at 10:15 yesterday morning, with written notice served to Nelson and Waters Realty. Any verbal agreement you may have had with Mr. Benton is now moot, as you never had ownership authority, and the signatory authority you had was revocable. I have filed preliminary notice with the county clerk indicating that your mother is the sole legal owner of record for this property, and that any attempts to encumber, sell, or develop the property without her express written consent will be met with immediate legal action. Dr. Washburn, whom I have known for 20 years, has conducted a preliminary cognitive assessment and has issued a letter, which I can hand you a copy of, stating that your mother exhibits no observable signs of cognitive impairment. She will complete a formal assessment on Tuesday. That formal assessment will be entered into the court record in the event that any competency proceedings are initiated against your mother, which I understand you may have been contemplating. If such proceedings are initiated, we will defeat them. I want to be very clear with you, David. As a matter of professional courtesy, and because I have known your father for 40 years, I am telling you this directly and privately, before any lawyers for either side make things worse. If you attempt to have your mother declared incompetent, you will lose. You will lose badly, and you will, in the process, destroy any remaining possibility of a relationship with her. Do you understand what I am saying?" David looked at the floor. "Yes." "Good. Now, is there anything else you would like to discuss with your mother, in a non-legal capacity, while you are here?" David looked at his mother. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he said, "Mom, what are you doing with the barn?" Margaret's heart did not jump. She had prepared for this question. She had prepared for it carefully. "I am cleaning it out, David. It has been accumulating for 60 years. Harold's things are still there. Your grandfather's things. Things I have not had the strength to sort through. I am sorting them now. Sam is helping me. Sam has had a grain truck at the property 3 nights in a row. Curtis was there last night. I have friends in this town too, Mom. I know what has been happening." The kitchen went quiet. Margaret looked at her son. She could feel the others in the room looking at her, waiting to see how she would answer, and she thought for a moment about what Harold would have wanted her to say, and then she thought about what she herself wanted to say, and she decided. "David," she said, "your father and I have been keeping a secret for a very long time. A secret from before your grandfather. A secret that has to do with the barn. I am going to tell you about it. Not because you deserve to know, after what you have done, but because you are my son, and because what is happening in that barn is going to become a news story in the next few weeks, and I do not want you to hear about it from a newspaper. I want you to hear about it from me. I want you to hear about it in this kitchen where you grew up." David sat down at the table without being invited. He put his hands on the wood. He looked at them. Margaret told him. She told him about Otto Kaufmann and the 1902 manifest. She told him about the journal and the coffee can and Harold's 20 years of careful, quiet work. She told him about the reliquary and the paintings and the manuscripts and the 143 items that had been hidden inside a barn in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, since 1934. She did not tell him every number. She did not tell him the auction estimates. But she told him enough that he understood. When she was finished, David sat very still. "Mom," he said. His voice was hollow. "Are you telling me that the barn I had the inspector red tag, the barn I was going to have bulldozed as part of the sale to Benton, that barn?" "Yes, David." Has things worth?" "Yes, David." David put his face in his hands. "Oh my God," he said. "Oh my God." He sat like that for a long time. Nobody spoke. Finally, David lifted his head. His eyes were wet. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because your father asked me not to, David. He told me the time would come when it was right. And for 13 years I did not know whether that time would ever come. And then you drove me to Sunset Meadows, and the time came. Because you forced it." David stared at her. He did not say anything. "I want you to understand something," Margaret said. "I am not telling you about the barn because I want to give you money. I am not going to give you money, David. Not from this. Not a penny. The reason is not because I am angry, although I am. The reason is that this is not mine to give. Most of what is in that barn belongs to other people, to descendants of families that were destroyed in the war, to museums and churches and communities that have been waiting a long time to have their histories returned to them. Beverly Chun and her colleagues are going to work with me over the next year to find the rightful heirs of every item. Some of it, the items that cannot be traced to surviving heirs or institutional claimants, will be sold at auction. The proceeds from those sales, after legal fees and Beverly's academic compensation, will go to a foundation. The foundation is going to be called the Otto Kaufmann Memorial Foundation, and it is going to provide educational grants for the children of Holocaust survivors and for graduate students studying dislocated cultural property. That is what Harold wanted. That is what I want. And that is what is going to happen. David did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, I understand. I do not want you in this house right now, David. I do not want you on this property. I need time. I need time to not hate you, which is something I have to work toward, because right now I hate you very much, and I do not want to hate my son. I am going to need several months, at minimum. During those months, you are not to come here. You are not to contact me except through Phil. You are not to contact any of these people in the room. You are not to contact Beverly Chun or any of the people who are helping me. You are not to speak to Benton or to any realtor about any of this. If you do any of those things, I am going to the sheriff, and I am going to the Attorney General of Ohio, and I am going to every newspaper in the state. Do you understand me? Yes, Mom. At some point, David, I may forgive you. I do not know when, but I want to forgive you, because you are my son and because I loved you from the moment I felt you move inside me, and that is not something that goes away. But you are going to have to earn my forgiveness, and you are going to have to earn it slowly, and Patricia is going to have to earn it separately. Do you understand that as well? Yes, Mom. Good. Now, you have a long drive back to Cleveland. I suggest you get on the road before it gets dark. David stood up slowly. He looked around the kitchen one more time. He looked at his mother. He opened his mouth to say something else, and then he closed it. He turned and walked out the mudroom door. A moment later, the silver sedan started up, backed down the driveway, and was gone. The kitchen was silent for perhaps 30 seconds. Sam spoke first. Margaret, you all right? Margaret put her hands flat on the table. She took a long, slow breath. I will be, she said. Imani, please do not put any of that in your article. I wouldn't have anyway, Mrs. Ellison, Imani said quietly. That was a family conversation. It is not mine to print. Margaret nodded. She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. She looked at the others. Thank you. All of you. I don't know what I would have done without you. Phil Raymond patted her hand. You would have done the same thing, Margaret. You just would have had to do it harder and alone. And you shouldn't have to do anything alone. Not at 81. Not after what you have already been through. Curtis Navarro, who had not spoken all day, cleared his throat. Margaret, if you do not mind my saying, that was the hardest thing I ever watched anybody do. And you did it like a professional. Margaret almost laughed. Curtis, I have been rehearsing that conversation since 1998. Sam stood up and went to the refrigerator, which was nearly empty, and found a bottle of wine that Clara had brought over the night before. He poured glasses for everyone who wanted one. Margaret took hers with both hands. They sat in the nearly empty kitchen in the late afternoon light, and they drank wine, and nobody said very much. And after a while the light through the kitchen window turned gold, and then amber, and then the color of bruised apples, and Margaret Ellison, alive in her own home for the first time in 11 weeks and 4 days, let the quiet settle around her shoulders like a blanket. Beverly Chin called on Sunday morning with news that changed everything. Mrs. Ellison, can I put you on speaker? I'm in my advisor's office. Dr. Whitfield is here. Yes, Beverly. Sam is here too. I'll put us on speaker. Mrs. Ellison, this is Peter Whitfield. It is a pleasure to speak with you. I want to tell you, before we begin, that Beverly has told me everything, and I have spent most of the last 24 hours verifying portions of what she described. I am not a skeptic by nature, but I am a professional, and I needed to confirm certain items before I could commit my department's resources. I have now confirmed them. What you have in that picket barn is, based on the photographs Beverly has shared with me, the most significant private recovery of dislocated European cultural property in the last 50 years. Perhaps longer. We are going to need to move carefully. We are also going to need to move quickly. How quickly, Professor Whitfield? Let me explain. The reliquary. I spent the night emailing colleagues in Dusseldorf and Cologne. By dawn this morning, I had responses from 3 separate institutions. The piece is known. It has been on a missing items list maintained by the Catholic Archdiocese of Cologne since 1953. I spoke this morning with Monsignor Franz Weber, who is the Archdiocese's chief archivist. He wept on the phone. Mrs. Ellison, I have never made a cleric weep before. He told me that if the reliquary is authenticated, the Archdiocese wishes to purchase it back, at fair market value, and return it to its original church, which has been rebuilt near Cologne. They have been saving for exactly this eventuality for 70 years. Their reserve fund is approximately $900,000. They are prepared to wire that sum upon authentication. Margaret put her hand on her chest. She had to sit down. And that, Whitfield continued, is one piece. There are more. Beverly's preliminary photographs suggest that at least 40 of the items in Harold's catalog can likely be traced to specific surviving heirs or institutional claimants. Some of those items are going to generate emotional and legal complexities. Some of them will require years of careful work. But Mrs. Ellison, I want you to understand something. Every single item in that barn is going to find its proper home. Every single one. And the items that cannot be traced, or whose heirs have declined claim, will be sold at auction through reputable houses, and the proceeds, once your foundation is established, will fund the kind of memorial work Harold apparently hoped for. Beverly has told me about your intentions. I want you to know that our department will assist you, at no cost to you, in establishing the foundation and in structuring it properly. This is, for us, the culmination of careers' worth of work. It is an honor. Thank you, Professor. There is one more matter. I want to prepare you. The news of this recovery will not stay quiet for long. Within a week, perhaps 2, word will reach the larger art world. Reporters will come. Not local reporters. The New York Times, the Associated Press, German newspapers, Israeli newspapers. There will be television. I want you to be prepared for this. I want you to decide now, in advance, how you wish to handle it. Because once it begins, it will move very quickly, and you will not have time to think. Margaret looked at Sam. Sam was watching her with careful eyes. Professor, can I ask you to do something for me? Of course. Can I ask you to handle the press, when it comes? Can I ask you to be the face of this? I am 81 years old. I do not want to be on television. I do not want cameras on my porch. I want the work to be done, and I want the items to go home, and I want Otto Kaufmann and Harold's grandfather and Harold to be remembered. But I do not want my face to be in the newspaper. I do not want reporters calling my son. I have been through enough. The work is more important than my story. There was a pause on the line. Mrs. Ellison, Whitfield said, that is not going to work the way you are hoping it will work. Your story is the story. The escape from the nursing home, the return home, the barn, Harold's 20 years. You are going to have to accept that the public will want to know about you. What I can do, however, is help you control it. I can arrange for a single extended interview with a journalist I trust, after which your privacy is protected. I can insist that any coverage of you be respectful and accurate. I can help you write a statement that establishes the terms on which you are willing to engage with the media. I can do those things. And Beverly and I can handle everything else. Mrs. Ellison, Beverly said quietly, may I say something? Please. Imani Baker, the reporter at the Gazette. I think she should have the story first. I think you should let her write it, at length, on your terms. I think you should let her publish it locally, in the Gazette, and let the wire services pick it up from there. That way the first version anyone reads is the one you have approved. That way the people of Cedar Hollow are the first to learn what their town has been sitting on. That way Imani's career, which sounds like it deserves a boost, gets the boost it deserves. Margaret thought about this for a long moment. She thought about Imani's quiet face at her kitchen table yesterday. She thought about Imani's grandmother in Cleveland. Yes, Margaret said. I like that. Peter, can you call Imani and work with her? I trust her, but I do not know how the journalism part of this works, and I want to make sure she is set up properly. I do not want her scooped by a bigger paper before she has her own story out. I'll speak to her this afternoon. I will also call a colleague at the Times who owes me a favor, and I will ask him to hold any reporting they do until Imani's piece has run. He may or may not honor that, but I will ask. Thank you, Peter. One more thing, Mrs. Ellison. I want to ask you a delicate question. Go ahead. Security. You now have, in a condemned barn in rural Ohio, items that are collectively worth, based on Beverly's preliminary estimates, somewhere between $12 and $25 million. That information is currently known only to a small circle of people. Once news of this breaks, every criminal and con artist in 3 states will become interested in your barn, your property, and you. I want you to prepare for that now. I would like to recommend that you move the items, once cataloging is complete at the picket location, to the climate-controlled secure storage facility I mentioned to Beverly earlier. I can arrange the transfer. I can arrange insurance. I can arrange for qualified art handlers. All I need is your authorization and a few days. Do it, Peter. Whatever it costs. Whatever insurance you need. Do it. Thank you. I will begin on Monday morning. They hung up. Margaret sat for a long time with her hands flat on Sam's kitchen table. Sam poured her more coffee. Margaret, Sam said. Yes, Sam. $900,000. For one thing. From a church in Germany. Yes, Sam. And that's one of 143 things. Yes, Sam. Sam sat down across from her. He looked at her over his coffee cup for a long moment. You're Harold, he said. That quiet mechanic I used to change brake pads with. He was one of the most remarkable men I ever knew, and I did not know the half of it until this week. Margaret smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was hers. Nobody did, Sam. That was the thing about Harold. He never wanted anybody to know. The cataloging continued at the picket barn through the rest of the weekend. The team had refined its procedures. Beverly had set up a portable photography station with proper lighting in the small front area of the barn that Curtis and Wendell had weatherproofed on Friday night. Clara handled the archival packing with the careful hands of a woman who had spent her entire adult life caring for fragile things. Dolores kept the inventory log on a laptop Beverly had brought. Mike Handler's grain truck made 2 more runs from the Kaufmann barn to the picket barn on Saturday night, and by Sunday afternoon, 112 of the 143 items in Harold's catalog had been located, photographed, and moved. 31 items remained unaccounted for. Beverly and Margaret sat with Harold's journal open between them in the picket barn on Sunday afternoon, going through the remaining entries one by one. 4 of these, Harold marked with a small asterisk, Beverly said. Look, here, and here, and here. Margaret leaned in. She had never noticed the asterisks. Harold's handwriting was dense, and she had never read the journal in detail, because most of it referred to things she had never seen. Harold never explained the asterisks to me, she said. Look at what the asterisks are next to. Oil painting, Italian school, and signed, circa 1510. Manuscript, Latin, devotional, circa 1275. Silver chalice, Venetian, circa 1590. And this one, bronze bust, Roman, circa 100 AD. What do they have in common? Beverly ran her finger down the entries. All 4 of them are items with very high value. But all 4 of them are also items whose provenance Otto did not fully document. Look, in all 4 cases, Harold wrote, origin unclear, tag missing, or unverified. I think, Mrs. Ellison, these were items that Otto may have acquired under circumstances he was not fully certain about. Items that may not have been entrusted to him by families. Items he may have purchased or been given without clear documentation. So they might not have rightful heirs to return to. It is not that simple. Any item produced in Italy before 1909, if it left Italy without a proper export license, is legally the property of the Italian government under the Pacca Edict and subsequent cultural heritage laws. A Roman bronze, in particular, would be of tremendous interest to the Italian Ministry of Culture. It cannot be sold at auction in the United States or Europe without first establishing clear legal title. But Mrs. Ellison, look at where Harold marked these. He listed them in the journal, but he did not list them in the catalog of locations. He put 4 asterisks. He never told you where in the barn they were. Margaret looked at her. Why would he do that? I do not know. Perhaps he was not sure what to do with them, and he wanted to think about them more. Perhaps he hid them somewhere separate, in case the rest were ever discovered. Perhaps he moved them. We will need to find them, Mrs. Ellison, and we will need to make sure they are handled properly. Margaret sat back. For missing items. For items Harold had deliberately kept even more hidden than the rest. Where do we start? We go back to the Kaufmann barn. We search every inch of it, and we hope Harold left another clue somewhere. They drove back to the Kaufmann barn that afternoon. Sam drove. Curtis came along. Wendell brought a toolbox. Beverly brought her notebook. Margaret brought Harold's journal and, for the first time since 2012, Harold's personal papers, the ones she had brought down from the attic on Saturday morning and stored in a file box in the kitchen. They searched the Kaufmann barn systematically. They examined every beam. They tapped every wall section. They lifted every loose floorboard. They crawled through the hayloft with flashlights. They found no additional hiding places. The barn, which had seemed to Margaret on Thursday night like a bottomless treasure chest, revealed no further secrets. They were sitting on the tailgate of Sam's pickup, watching the sun go down, when Margaret thought of something. "Sam," she said. "The reading chair." "What reading chair?" "Harold's reading chair. The one he died in. It was in the living room. Patricia took it. She told me last year she was going to have it reupholstered for David's office. She was never going to reupholster it. She was going to throw it out." Sam frowned. "What about the chair, Margaret?" Harold kept something in the chair. Some of his papers. Things he was reading. Things he did not want to leave in his desk. He cut a small pocket into the underside of the seat cushion. "Sam. He showed me once, laughing about it, saying it was his secret place, that if Patricia or David ever cleaned up around him, they wouldn't find the articles he was in the middle of reading. I had forgotten about it. I had completely forgotten." "Where is the chair?" Patricia said Delaware. "A storage unit. Or she threw it out." Margaret's heart had begun to beat very hard. "Sam, we have to find that chair." On Monday morning at 8:30, Phil Raymond called the storage facility in Delaware. He used David's full name and the power of attorney documentation David had used to access the facility 2 months ago. Phil was polite. Phil was professional. Phil explained that he was representing David's mother, who was disputing certain items that had been removed from her home without her knowledge, and that he needed to verify the current disposition of the contents of the storage unit. The storage facility manager, a man named Ken, said that the unit had been paid up through January. No items had been removed since the initial deposit. He offered to send Phil an inventory, which Phil accepted. The inventory arrived by email 30 minutes later. Item 47, 1 leather. Reading chair, green, upholstery worn. Margaret, sitting at Phil's desk, put her hand over her mouth. Sam drove her to Delaware that afternoon. Phil came with them, carrying an envelope of legal documents. At the storage facility, Phil spent 15 minutes explaining to Ken the legal situation, and Ken, after a phone call to his regional manager, agreed to let Margaret access the unit in the presence of her attorney. The unit was on the second floor, in a row of identical orange doors. Ken unlocked it for them. Inside, stacked in the careful way of someone who had packed professionally and quickly, was 58 years of Margaret Ellison's life. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment. She did not go inside right away. Sam put his hand on her shoulder. Phil waited. Finally, Margaret stepped into the unit, and she walked directly past the couch she had bought in 1978, past the china cabinet, past the grandfather clock, and she went to the back wall, where Patricia had apparently stacked the items she considered least important, and there, behind a stack of quilts and under a moving blanket, was Harold's reading chair. Margaret knelt in front of it. Sam came over and knelt with her. He lifted the seat cushion gently. On the underside, nearly invisible, was a slit Harold had cut into the fabric with a utility knife 50 years ago. Margaret reached in with her fingers. She pulled out a folded manila envelope. Inside the envelope were 4 photographs and a handwritten letter. The photographs showed 4 items that were not in the Kaufmann barn: an oil painting of a kneeling woman, a small leather-bound Latin manuscript, a silver chalice on a velvet cloth, and a bronze bust of a young man with curly hair and thoughtful eyes. On the back of each photograph, in Harold's handwriting, was a word or a phrase. Photograph 1, the painting, County Museum. Photograph 2, the manuscript, Cincinnati University Archives. Photograph 3, the chalice, Harbor Bank, Box 847. Photograph 4, the bronze bust, St. Mary's Rectory, behind the altar. The letter was dated July 11, 2012, 2 weeks before Harold's stroke. Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have figured out that there were items I did not store in the barn. You are a sharp woman, Margaret, and I always trusted that you would piece it together if you needed to. I am sorry I did not tell you about these before, but the Italian provenance items worried me. I could not confirm whose they had been. I did not want to leave you with pieces that might draw the wrong kind of attention if something happened to me before we had a plan. So I placed them, quietly, with 4 institutions I trusted. Each of them believes me to be an anonymous donor. Each of them is storing the items for me, without formal title transfer, and each has instructions that if I do not check in by a certain date each year, the items are to be transferred into their permanent collections. I chose the 4 institutions carefully. They are the right homes for these things. The museums and universities in question have the expertise and the scholarly networks to determine the right course. If you find these items and wish to claim them back, you can. Each institution has a sealed envelope with my real name and a code phrase. The code phrase is Otto's garden. Present yourself, show the photograph, say the phrase, and the item is yours, along with all of my documentation. But Margaret, I am asking you, if you are reading this, to leave them where they are. They are safe. They are being cared for. They are in the right hands. And they do not carry the complications that surrounding their sale would create. Let them be. I love you. I have loved you every day since September 14th, 1965, which is the day I decided you were going to be my wife, even though you did not know it for another year. Take care of the rest of the barn. Do the right thing. And know that you have done a thing no one else on this earth would have been patient enough or brave enough to do. Harold. Margaret sat on the floor of the storage unit and wept silently for 10 minutes. Sam sat beside her and did not say anything. Phil stood at the doorway, giving them privacy. When Margaret was finished, she folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. And then she put the envelope in her canvas tote bag, and she stood up, and she said, "Sam, can you help me get this chair in the truck? I want to take it home." Of course. They took the chair. They took 3 boxes of Harold's books that Patricia had apparently been planning to donate to a thrift store. They took a small framed photograph of Margaret and Harold at their wedding, which Patricia had packed upside down in a box of kitchen towels. They left the rest. Margaret did not want the couch or the china cabinet back. Those things could wait. There would be time. On the drive home, Margaret sat in the passenger seat with Harold's letter on her lap. She read it twice more as Sam drove. The phrase, Otto's garden, kept circling in her mind. "Sam," she said, as they passed the county line back into Cedar Hollow, "I am going to do what Harold asked. I am going to leave the 4 institutional items where they are. I am going to trust him." "That sounds right, Margaret. I am also going to go visit each of those institutions. Quietly. On my own, with Beverly. I am going to introduce myself to the curators. I am going to tell them that the anonymous donor was Harold Ellison, a mechanic from Cedar Hollow, Ohio, who spent 20 years teaching himself art history in order to do the right thing by Otto Kaufmann. I am going to make sure Harold's name is known. I am going to make sure that when those items are eventually displayed, the plaque mentions the man who placed them there. Do you think he would mind?" Sam drove for a long moment before answering. "Margaret," he said finally, "Harold Ellison was the most private man I ever met. He did not want attention. He did not want recognition. He would not have wanted his name on a museum plaque. I know. But he also would not have wanted to argue with you. And I think if you told him this was what you had decided, and that you had decided it for good reasons, he would have smiled that small smile of his, the one where the left corner came up before the right, and he would have said, 'All right, Mag. You do what you think is right. You always do.'" Margaret smiled. Her eyes were wet. He did say that, actually. 100 times, at least. He meant it every time. They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and the October sun was low and gold over the cornfields, and Margaret Ellison sat with her dead husband's letter in her lap and understood, not in the way she had understood it before, but in a new and deeper way, that she had been loved very well for a very long time by a man who had known her better than she had known herself. Imani Baker's article ran in the Tuesday edition of the Cedar Hollow Gazette on October 28th, under the headline "The Barn That Remembers, a Cedar Hollow Mystery 70 Years in the Making." It ran to 4,000 words across the front page and 2 inside pages, with photographs Imani had taken herself of the exterior of the Kaufmann barn and of Harold and Margaret on their wedding day in 1966. It did not include any photographs of the items, which Dr. Whitfield had insisted on withholding for security reasons. It did not include a specific dollar estimate, for the same reason. But it included everything else. The escape from Sunset Meadows, the $9 barn, the coffee can, the journal, Otto Kaufmann walking into the woods in November of 1934, Harold's 20 years. Beverly Chun and Peter Whitfield. The plans for the foundation. The reliquary going home to Cologne. The Associated Press picked up the story on Wednesday morning. The New York Times ran a piece on Thursday. By Friday, the story was in the Jerusalem Post, and Der Spiegel, and Le Monde. Margaret, on Sam's strict instructions, did not answer her phone. Phil Raymond had arranged for all media calls to be routed to Whitfield's office at Ohio State. Whitfield had designated a graduate student to handle the hundreds of incoming inquiries. By Saturday afternoon, 5 separate reporters had driven out to Cedar Hollow and tried to find Margaret. Sam met each of them at the end of Margaret's driveway with his hands in his pockets and a polite, flat refusal. Mrs. Ellison is not giving interviews. You can speak to Professor Whitfield at Ohio State. Please drive back out the way you came in. The town of Cedar Hollow, which for months had watched Margaret Ellison disappear into a nursing home and had said nothing, now closed around her. Clara organized a schedule. Someone from the town was always in a car parked on Ellison Road, keeping an eye on the property. Curtis walked the perimeter once a day. Wendell had replaced the padlock on the Kaufmann barn with a commercial-grade lock that Whitfield's security consultant had recommended, and had added a simple alarm system that called Sam's cell phone if anyone tried to approach. And on Saturday evening at 6:30, as Margaret was finishing a plate of pot roast that Clara had brought over in a covered dish, the landline rang. Margaret, who had been screening all calls, looked at the number on the old caller ID box. It was a local number she did not recognize. She let it ring 3 times. Then something told her to answer. "Hello? Mrs. Ellison?" It was a man's voice. Older. Careful. "Mrs. Ellison, my name is Lyle Benton. Before you hang up, I want to say that I am not calling to ask you to sell me your property. I am calling to apologize. I read the article in the Gazette on Tuesday. I have been trying to decide for 5 days whether to call you. I decided that I should. I wanted you to hear from me directly that I am sorry for the role I played in what happened to you. I did not know about the barn. I did not know about anything that was in that barn. But I did know that I was pressuring your son. I did know that I was offering him money knowing that he had no clear authority to sell. I did know that I was part of what pushed him toward the nursing home. And I am sorry for that, Mrs. Ellison. Truly. I have been buying up land in this part of the state for 15 years, and I have never thought very much about the families that came with the land. I am going to think about it now." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Benton," she said finally, "thank you for calling. I will not call again, Mrs. Ellison. I will not approach your property. If you ever wish to speak to me again, you know where to find me. I hope you never need to." He hung up. Margaret set the receiver down. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the clock on the wall. Then she went into the living room, where Harold's reading chair now sat in the corner by the window, the only piece of furniture besides the kitchen table and her cot, and she sat down in it for the first time in 13 years, and the leather still smelled faintly like him, and she closed her eyes, and she did not cry. She had cried enough for 1 week. She simply sat in her husband's chair in her own house, in her own life, and she listened to the evening wind move through the oak tree in the front yard, the same oak tree that had been there when Harold had carried her across the threshold in 1967, the same oak tree that had watched her leave in a car with her son in August, the same oak tree that had watched her come home. The foundation was called, formally, the Otto Kaufmann Memorial Foundation for Cultural Restitution and Historical Memory. It was established on paper on November 14th, 91 years to the day after Otto Kaufmann had walked into the woods. Phil Raymond handled the incorporation. Professor Whitfield chaired the first board meeting by conference call from Columbus. Margaret served as honorary founder. Beverly Chun became the foundation's first full-time researcher, funded initially by a small grant from the Mellon Foundation that Whitfield had secured. Sam served on the board. Clara served on the board. Imani, at Margaret's insistence, served as communications director on a part-time basis, paid a small stipend out of the foundation's initial operating budget. The first authentication appointment was scheduled for December 9th in New York, where a panel of 3 specialists would examine the reliquary under the auspices of Christie's. Beverly would fly with the piece. Whitfield would accompany her. Insurance had been arranged. The specialists had cleared their calendars. And on a Wednesday in late November, as the first snow of the year was settling over the Ohio fields, Margaret Ellison sat at her kitchen table and wrote, in her own handwriting on a yellow legal pad, the first paragraph of a letter to the Rothenberg family's only known descendant, a man named Joseph Rothenberg, who lived in Tel Aviv, and who was the great-nephew of the two people who had entrusted a small silver reliquary to an Austrian-German woodworker named Otto Kaufmann in the summer of 1912, 3 months before they had boarded a train to begin a journey that would end 3 decades later in a place called Auschwitz. Margaret had not yet met Joseph Rothenberg. She had spoken with him once, on a video call that Beverly had arranged the week before. He had been a small, elderly man with thick glasses, and he had cried when Beverly had explained who Margaret was. He had said, in his careful English, "Mrs. Ellison, thank you. Thank you for your husband. Thank you for yourself. The reliquary. It was my great-uncle's favorite thing in the world. He used to tell my mother stories about it, when she was a little girl, before. Thank you." Margaret wrote, on the yellow legal pad, "Dear Mr. Rothenberg." And then she stopped, because she did not yet know what else to say. She set down the pen. She looked out the kitchen window at the snow. There was still so much work to do. The items in secure storage. The descendants to find. The legal complications. The auction houses. The foundation's operations. The rest of her life. But for the first time since August, Margaret Ellison felt herself at the beginning of something instead of at the end of it. She picked up the pen again. She began to write. The authentication took place on the morning of December 9th in a windowless room on the 4th floor of Christie's New York offices on Rockefeller Plaza. Margaret had not gone. Margaret had stayed in Cedar Hollow because the idea of being in a room full of specialists in suits examining something that had sat under a rusted coffee can in her husband's workbench felt, she told Sam, like watching a doctor examine a newborn. Too private. Too much. Beverly had flown instead, with Professor Whitfield, and Monsignor Franz Weber had flown from Cologne with 2 officials from the Archdiocese, and 3 authentication specialists had gathered with their white gloves and their calibrated instruments and their very old books. The authentication took 6 hours. When it was finished, the senior specialist, a woman named Dr. Ingrid Halberstam, who had been cataloging medieval European silverwork for 43 years, set down her magnifying glass and looked at Beverly and Whitfield across the examination table. She took off her glasses. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. She said, in German first and then in English, "It is the reliquary. There is no question. The inscription matches the 1912 inventory photograph. The hallmarks on the base match the Cologne workshop records of the period. The stone is authentic. The piece is authentic. It has come home." Monsignor Weber crossed himself. He walked around the table and embraced Beverly. He was a small, stooped man of 73, and he wept into her shoulder without shame. And Beverly, who had told Margaret afterward that she had held herself together all morning with great professional effort, finally let herself cry as well. Whitfield stood back and watched, with his hands folded in front of him, and later he told Margaret that he had felt, in that moment, that he had spent his entire career preparing to witness exactly such a scene. The wire transfer from the Archdiocese of Cologne landed in the Foundation's newly established trust account at 3:47 that afternoon. $975,000. Phil Raymond called Margaret from his office to tell her the money had cleared. Margaret set down the phone. She walked into the living room, where Harold's reading chair sat by the window, and she lowered herself into it slowly, and she looked out at the snow on the fields, and she said, out loud to no one, "Harold, the first one is home." Joseph Rothenberg arrived in Cedar Hollow on the 22nd of January. He flew from Tel Aviv to New York, from New York to Columbus, and Sam drove the 2 hours north to pick him up at the airport because Margaret had refused to let anyone else do it. He was 87 years old. He was smaller than Margaret had imagined from their video call, frail, with a slight tremor in his right hand that he apologized for, in his soft accented English. He carried a single small suitcase and a wool overcoat that had clearly been purchased for the Ohio winter specifically. Margaret met him on the front porch. She had not slept the night before. She had cleaned the house 3 times that morning. She had made a pot roast that Clara had helped her with. She had been rehearsing, in her head, what she would say. When Joseph stepped out of Sam's truck and looked up at the porch, all of the rehearsing evaporated. She simply walked down the steps and put out her hands, and he took them in both of his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Mrs. Ellison," he said finally, "I have been trying to imagine your face for 2 months. Margaret, please. Mr. Rothenberg, please come in." It is very cold. Joseph. They went inside. Sam, who understood such things, did not come in. He drove away, promising to return in 3 hours. Margaret sat Joseph in Harold's reading chair, because she had decided, in the night, that he should sit there. She poured him tea. She poured herself tea. They looked at each other. Joseph, Margaret said, the reliquary is not here. It is already in Cologne. The archdiocese took possession of it on the 11th. I want you to know that, so that you understand what I am about to tell you. I know. Professor Whitfield told me. Mrs. Ellison. Margaret. The reliquary. It was my great-uncle's favorite thing, yes. But it was his faith, you understand. The object, it belongs in the church, where my great-uncle would have wanted it. That is the right place. I did not come here for the reliquary. Then why did you come? Joseph set down his teacup. His eyes, behind the thick glasses, were very clear and very old. I came because I wanted to sit in the house of the woman who finished what Otto Kaufmann started. I came because my mother, may she rest, used to tell me stories, when I was a little boy in Palestine, about her uncle who had given something precious to a man named Otto. My mother did not know what had happened to Otto. My mother did not know what had happened to the reliquary. My mother went to her grave not knowing. And I, who am her son, I thought I would also go to my grave not knowing. And then a young woman from Ohio State University called me on a Tuesday in November and told me. And I felt, Mrs. Ellison, I felt my mother and my great-uncle and my great-aunt and every person in my family who went into the smoke. I felt them all standing in my living room in Tel Aviv, listening to the phone call. I wanted to come and sit in the house where the thing had been kept safe. I wanted to touch the table where the woman who kept it sits. I wanted to say thank you, in person, to her, and through her, to her husband, and to his grandfather, and to Otto, and I wanted to do this while I am still alive to do it. That is why I came, Margaret. Margaret could not speak. She simply reached across the small space between them and took his hand, and they sat like that for a long time, two old people in a nearly empty farmhouse in Ohio, holding hands across a kitchen table that had been in a garage 2 months ago. They talked all afternoon. Joseph told her about his mother, Hannah, who had been 6 years old when her family had sent her from Cologne to Palestine in 1938, hidden in the household of a Catholic family who were traveling for a medical treatment, passing her off as their ailing daughter. Hannah had lived. Her parents had not. Her grandparents, the Rothenbergs, the ones who had trusted the reliquary to Otto, had not. Joseph had been born in Haifa in 1938 to an older sister of Hannah's who had emigrated earlier, and he had grown up hearing about the cousin who had come to them at 6 years old speaking only German, who had become his aunt after she was adopted by the family, and who had died in 2003 without ever having returned to Cologne. I am going to Cologne in April, Joseph said. The archdiocese has invited me to the ceremony when they place the reliquary back in the reconstructed chapel. They have asked me to speak. I am not a man who speaks, Mrs. Ellison. I was a mathematician. I am shy, but I am going to speak. I am going to tell them about my mother. I am going to tell them about Otto. I am going to tell them about Harold Ellison. You will be there? Margaret had not planned to go. Yes, she said. I will be there. Good. Then I will not be the only one who is shy. We will be shy together. When Sam came back at 6, Joseph stood slowly and took Margaret's hands again. I will come back, Mrs. Ellison, if you will have me. I would like to see your husband's workbench. I would like to see where the reliquary was kept. Not today. I am too tired today. But in the spring, perhaps, when the weather is kinder. Anytime, Joseph. Anytime. He got back into Sam's truck. Margaret stood on the porch and watched them drive away. The winter sun had already set. She could see her breath. She stood there until the truck disappeared around the bend past the oak tree, and then she stood there a little longer, looking at nothing in particular, feeling something rearrange itself in the shape of her life. The items went home over the course of the next 14 months. Not all of them, because some of the Provenance trails were longer than Beverly's schedule and longer than anyone's patience. But enough of them that Margaret came to understand what Professor Whitfield had meant when he had said the work would be the culmination of careers. There was the small oil painting by the minor Flemish master, which turned out to have been the property of a family from Antwerp, whose last surviving heir was a woman named Marguerite de Vries, who ran a flower shop in Bruges. Beverly had flown the painting to Brussels. Marguerite de Vries had called Margaret afterward to tell her, through a translator, that she had hung the painting above her kitchen table, and that she thought of Margaret every morning when she drank her coffee. There was the Book of Hours, which had gone to the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, where it joined a collection of manuscripts from the same workshop and was put on permanent display with a plaque acknowledging, at Margaret's gentle insistence, the work of Otto Kaufmann and Harold Ellison. There were the silver candlesticks from Augsburg, which went back to a synagogue in that city that had been rebuilt in 1998 and which had been hoping for decades that something of its original furnishings might someday be recovered. There was the gold chalice from Nuremberg, which went to a Catholic parish in Würzburg that had lost everything in the war. There was a small bronze figurine, 7th century Byzantine, which the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York purchased from the foundation for $410,000 and which was now on display in the Byzantine Gallery with a card that read, in small letters at the bottom, Provenance, Kaufmann Ellison Recovery, 2025. There were items that did not find families, because the families had not survived. Those items went to auction through Christie's and Sotheby's over the course of the spring and summer. The largest single sale was of a small triptych of early 15th century Italian panels, which had been purchased by a private collector for $1.8 million. The collector, a woman from Denver who had spoken to Margaret personally before the sale, had pledged to loan the triptych to the Cleveland Museum of Art for exhibitions over the next decade. The proceeds from the auctions, after legal fees and operational expenses, flowed into the foundation's trust. By October of the following year, 1 year after Margaret had walked out of Sunset Meadows, the foundation had assets of approximately $9 million. None of it was Margaret's. Margaret had been very clear about that from the beginning. The foundation was the foundation. Its mission was memorial, educational, and restitutive. Margaret took no salary, drew no stipend, and asked for nothing. She had, instead, rebuilt the farmhouse. Slowly, carefully, over the course of the year, she had repurchased what she needed to live. A new couch, modest. A kitchen table, also modest. Curtains. A bed to replace the cot. Phil Raymond had helped her negotiate with the auction house to recover her grandfather clock from Patricia's storage unit, which Patricia had been attempting, quietly, to sell on eBay, and which now stood in the front hall of the farmhouse, keeping its steady time. The hallway smelled again like the hallway Margaret had known for 58 years. The house knew her. The house remembered. The barn also knew her. The Kaufmann barn, once emptied, was not demolished. Margaret and the foundation had agreed that the structure itself was historically significant, and Curtis Navarro, who now served on the foundation's board as facilities coordinator, had drawn up plans with a preservation architect from Columbus for its restoration. The red tag had been removed in February. The leaky roof had been replaced in May. The old workbench had been restored, carefully, by a woodworker in Columbus who had apprenticed in a cabinet shop 40 years ago. The small compartments Otto had built into the walls had been preserved and documented. The barn would eventually open to the public as a small museum, run in partnership with the Foundation and the Ohio Historical Society, and its first exhibition, Margaret had been told, would document the story of Otto Kaufmann and Harold Ellison and the objects that had passed through Cedar Hollow on their way home. The opening was scheduled for the following spring. The picket barn, Margaret's $9 barn, had served its purpose and was being allowed to settle back into its condemned state. The foundation had agreed, at Margaret's suggestion, to maintain the 3/4-acre lot and eventually convert it into a small pollinator prairie. Clara had done the design. Dolores had handled the paperwork. The prairie would be dedicated the following June to the memory of Ruth Hoffman, Sam's wife, who had loved wildflowers and bees. David called in March. He had not called before that, obeying the months-long moratorium Margaret had imposed. When he called, Phil Raymond patched the call through to Margaret after screening it, and Margaret stood at her kitchen counter with the receiver in her hand, and she listened. "Mom," David said. His voice was thin. "Mom, I've been in therapy since November. Patricia and I have separated. I am not calling to ask for anything. I am calling because Phil told me I could call in March, and it is March. I am calling to say that I have had 5 months to think about what I did, and I do not have an explanation. I do not have a good reason. I was selfish, and I was scared, and I was weak, and I let Patricia's voice be louder in my head than yours should have been. I am sorry, Mom. I do not expect you to forgive me right now. I do not expect you to forgive me ever. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. and I will spend the rest of my life understanding it better. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. David, she said, I want to see you. Not yet, but soon. Come down in April, the weekend of the 12th. I am going to be alone, because everyone else will be in Cologne for Yosef's ceremony, which I am not attending after all because of my hip. Come down that Saturday. Stay for one night. We will eat dinner together. We will talk. We will see what is possible. Mom, I am not promising anything, David. I am giving you one evening. What happens after that depends on what happens during it. Yes, Mom. Thank you, Mom. Thursday the 12th. 3 in the afternoon. Do not be late, and do not be early. Yes, Mom. She hung up. On Saturday, April 12th, at precisely 3 in the afternoon, David's silver sedan, which he had apparently not been able to give up in the divorce, pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from the living room window. David climbed out alone. He was carrying a small paper bag. He walked up to the porch more slowly than he had walked up to it in October. When she opened the door, he held out the paper bag. I was not sure what to bring, he said. I brought bread. From the bakery on Coventry Road. You used to like it. She took the bag. She opened it. Inside was a loaf of the cinnamon raisin bread she had loved when she had lived in Cleveland Heights in the 80s. Patricia had, at some point over the years, decided that Margaret did not like cinnamon raisin bread anymore, and no one had corrected her. Come inside, David. They sat in the kitchen. Margaret made tea. She cut 2 slices of bread. They ate in silence for a while. Then Margaret asked him about the divorce, and David told her, haltingly, about the ways in which his marriage had been unraveling for years, about the things he had not seen because he had not wanted to see them, about the therapy, about a men's group he had joined, about the rental house he was living in by himself for the first time in his adult life. Margaret listened without comment. When he was finished, she asked him about the grandchildren. David's 2 grown children, who were 29 and 27 and who lived in California and New York and who had not been told by David, Margaret suspected, about Sunset Meadows at the time that it had happened. They know now, David said. They know everything. Sarah will not speak to me. Benjamin is trying. He came to visit last month. We talked for a long time. I am going to have to earn them back too, Mom. It is going to take a long time. It is going to take a long time with me as well, David. I know. Some of it, maybe, cannot be earned back. Some of it may be gone. I know. But some of it, maybe, can. David looked at her. His eyes filled. Mom, thank you for saying that. They ate dinner. Pot roast again. Margaret had not felt capable of cooking anything more elaborate. David cleaned the kitchen afterward. Margaret, watching him from Harold's chair, was surprised to find that this was the first time in perhaps 30 years that she had seen David wash a dish. He did it the way she had taught him when he was 12. The same circular motion with the scrubber. The same careful rinse. It was a small, ordinary thing. But the house saw it. The house noticed. He left at 9 in the morning on Sunday, after breakfast, and after an hour spent in the living room looking through a box of photographs Margaret had brought down from the attic. He stood in the doorway with his coat on. Mom, he said, can I come back in June? Let us say May. A Saturday. You will let me know which one. Yes, Mom. David. Yes. I love you. That part has never stopped. I want you to know that. He nodded. He could not speak. He went to his car. He drove away. Margaret went back inside. She sat in Harold's chair for a long time. She did not cry, because she had done enough crying, and because the crying that would have been appropriate for this particular moment was a quieter, slower kind, the kind that settled into a person over the course of years rather than the kind that arrived in waves. She sat, and she thought about her son, and she thought about her husband, and she thought about what it meant to forgive somebody who had hurt you terribly, and she did not arrive at any conclusions. She simply sat. The cinnamon raisin bread lasted 2 more days. Margaret ate the last slice on Tuesday morning, with butter, and she saved the paper bag. The ceremony in Cologne was held on April 27th in the reconstructed Kaufmann Chapel, a small side chapel of the St. Gerion Basilica, which had been rebuilt with private funds in the 1950s and which had been waiting, quietly, for 7 decades for its reliquary to return. Margaret did not go. The hip surgery she had scheduled for early April had been postponed until late May, but she was using it as a polite reason to decline. The real reason was that she could not yet bring herself to stand in a room full of people looking at her. Beverly went. Whitfield went. Joseph Rothenberg went, and he spoke. and a video recording of his speech was sent to Margaret 2 days later. She watched it in Harold's chair, with Sam and Clara on the new couch beside her, and she watched Joseph, 87 years old, small and shaking slightly at the lectern, tell the assembled crowd of worshippers and historians and reporters about his mother, about his great-uncle, about Otto Kaufmann walking into the woods in 1934, about a mechanic from Ohio who had taught himself art history so that he could do right by a dead man he had never met, about a woman named Margaret who had kept a secret for 13 years and then, when the time came, had broken all the right rules in all the right ways. He spoke for 8 minutes. At the end, he said, in his careful English, "The word restitution is a legal word. It is a cold word. What happened here today is not restitution. What happened here today is that a thing which had been lost has come home. I do not know how many of us are ever lucky enough to see, in our own lifetimes, a thing which was lost come home. I am very lucky. I am very grateful. My mother, who did not live to see this, I carry her with me today, and I know that she is listening. Thank you to all who made this possible. Thank you." Margaret watched the video twice. She wiped her face with a cloth napkin. Clara put her arm around Margaret's shoulders and held on for a while. Sam sat in the other chair and did not say anything, because Sam had learned, over the course of the year, that Margaret did not always need words, and that sometimes the best thing he could do was sit with her and be quiet. Joseph Rothenberg returned to Cedar Hollow in the first week of May, as he had promised. He came alone this time, having left his small suitcase at a hotel in Columbus, and Sam drove up to fetch him on a Wednesday morning. The weather had finally turned. The maples along Ellison Road were leafed out in the tender pale green of new spring, and the fields had been freshly turned, and the air smelled like wet earth and lilac. Margaret met them at the porch again, and this time she did not need to rehearse anything, because Joseph had already become, in some way she could not name, a person whose presence did not require rehearsing. She took him to the Kaufmann barn in the afternoon. Sam came with them, walking a pace behind, allowing them the space to talk. Margaret unlocked the door, and the three of them stepped inside. Joseph stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the clean-swept floor, the restored workbench, the quiet. Then he walked to the workbench and placed both of his hands flat on the wood. He stood like that, without moving, for perhaps a minute. "Otto," he said quietly. "Otto's Arbeitsplatz. His workplace." "Yes," Margaret said. Joseph turned to her. "And my great-uncle's reliquary sat beneath this bench, in the ground, for 90 years?" "Yes, Joseph." "And your husband's hands worked at this bench?" "Yes." Joseph nodded slowly. "It is a good bench," he said. "It is a good place. The thing knew it was safe here. The thing waited, all those years, because it knew it was safe. I am glad to see it. I am glad to stand here." They stayed for almost an hour. Joseph asked questions about the construction of the hidden compartments, and Sam, who had been helping Curtis with the restoration, was able to answer them. Joseph asked about Harold's father and grandfather, and Margaret told him what she knew, which was not a great deal, because Harold had never spoken much about the men before him. Joseph asked, finally, if he might sit on the small wooden bench Harold had built in 1971, and Margaret said yes, and Joseph sat, and Margaret sat next to him, and Sam leaned against the workbench, and for a long time none of them said anything at all. On the drive back to the farmhouse, Joseph asked if Margaret would mind stopping somewhere. "A small errand. It will only take a few minutes." "Of course. The cemetery, where your husband is buried." Margaret looked at Sam. Sam changed direction at the next crossroad. The small cemetery at the edge of Cedar Hollow sat on a low rise behind the Methodist church, bordered by a white picket fence that Harold had helped repaint in 1996. Margaret led Joseph to the plot, which sat in the oldest section of the cemetery under a young maple tree. Harold's headstone was modest, his name, his dates, and the phrase Margaret had chosen for him, which read simply "He was kind." Beside Harold's stone, the matching empty space waited, and Margaret's own marker, already carved with her name and birth year, stood ready for the day it would be needed. Joseph stood at the foot of Harold's grave for a long time. He had brought something with him, which he now removed from his coat pocket, a small smooth stone, about the size of a plum, which he had carried, he explained, from his mother's grave in Haifa. "In our tradition," he said, "we place stones on the graves of those we wish to honor. It is older than flowers. The flowers die, but the stones remain. I would like, with your permission, to leave this stone for your husband. It is from my mother. My mother would have wanted him to have it." Margaret could not speak. She nodded. Yosef placed the stone carefully on the top edge of Harold's headstone. He stepped back. He bowed his head. "Harold Ellison," he said, "my mother thanks you. My great-uncle thanks you. My family, the family I know and the family I will never know, thanks you. May your memory be a blessing. May your rest be peaceful. May the work you began continue in the hands of those who loved you." He was silent for a moment longer. Then he turned to Margaret, and he took her hands, and he said, "Margaret, I am an old man. I will probably not come back to Ohio again. This may be our last time together. I want to tell you something before I go. I want to tell you that in Hebrew we have a phrase, tikkun olam. It means the repair of the world. The idea is that the world is broken, always, and that every good thing any of us does is a small repair, a small mending. What you did, Margaret, you and your husband, was a large repair. It was one of the great repairs of a generation. I will carry the memory of you, and of this barn, and of this cemetery, for as long as I have memory. And when I am gone, my children will carry it, because I have told them, and they know." He kissed her on both cheeks, the European way. He walked with Sam back to the truck, slowly, because the ground was uneven and his hip was troubling him. Margaret stayed at the grave a moment longer. She reached out and touched the small, smooth stone that now sat on Harold's headstone. The stone was warm from Yosef's pocket. It was unremarkable. It was the most remarkable stone she had ever touched. "Harold," she whispered, "look who came to see you." She stood there in the May sunlight, 82 years old, with her hand on a stone from the Mediterranean resting on her husband's grave in Ohio, and she thought about the word tikkun, about the idea that the world was broken and that every small mending mattered. She thought about Otto Kaufmann walking into the woods in November of 1934. She thought about Harold at 32 lifting a floorboard. She thought about herself at 81 walking out of a laundry room with a canvas tote bag. All of them, in their turn, doing what they could. All of them, in their turn, repairing a small piece of the world. She turned, eventually, and walked back to the truck, and Sam drove Yosef back to Columbus that evening, and Margaret sat on her porch until the stars came out. The Foundation's first-year closing report was issued in November. Beverly Chun, who had defended her dissertation in September and had been hired as the Foundation's executive director at a salary she would not have been offered at any university for another decade, presented the report at a small board meeting held in Margaret's dining room. 41 items had been returned to direct heirs. 29 items had been placed in museums and religious institutions. 11 items had been sold at auction. 31 items remained in secure storage, their provenance still being researched, their final homes still being determined. The 4 items Harold had placed at the 4 institutions had been, after much discussion, allowed to remain there, with the institutions now formally aware of their provenance and with Harold's name added to each item's catalog record. Total net assets of the Foundation, after expenses and before the next round of planned disbursements to educational programs, stood at $7,240,000. The Foundation's first major educational grant, at Margaret's suggestion, had gone to the University of Haifa, which was establishing a new research center on dislocated cultural property in cooperation with Ohio State. The second grant had gone to a nonprofit organization in New York that helped elder care patients who were being pressured by family members into giving up their property. Margaret had insisted on that one. She had also insisted, over the initial resistance of the board, on the third grant, which had gone to a small organization in Ohio that helped working-class children take field trips to the Cleveland Museum of Art. When Whitfield had asked her why, Margaret had said, "Because that is how Harold started." Harold spent 3 summers of his life visiting the museum with library money, and it is why he knew what to do with the coffee when he found it. If we can put one more child on a bus to that museum, Harold is going to smile, wherever he is. Whitfield had not argued. Whitfield had stopped arguing with Margaret in January. The story, as Beverly had predicted, had continued to grow throughout the year. A documentary film crew from Germany had been allowed, after much negotiation, to film at the Kaufmann barn in June. A book was being written by a journalist from the Washington Post, in close collaboration with Imani Baker, whose career had indeed taken the boost Beverly had imagined and who now worked at a larger paper in Columbus while continuing to sit on the foundation's board. The documentary would premiere at a film festival in Berlin the following spring. The book would be published in Germany, Israel, and the United States the following fall. Margaret had agreed to one interview in the entire year with the New York Times, in which she had spoken for 90 minutes in her own kitchen with a reporter she had liked. The piece had run on a Sunday in September. Margaret had read it once, decided that it was accurate, and then had folded it up and placed it in the kitchen drawer where she kept, now, a small growing archive of her own life. She had declined all other interview requests. She had declined a profile in Vanity Fair. She had declined People magazine. She had declined a request from an Israeli morning television show. She had declined Oprah. She had declined, very politely, a publisher who had offered her $100,000 for a memoir. She did not want a memoir. She did not want to be a public person. She wanted to live her life in her farmhouse, with her friends, and to allow the foundation to do its work, and to allow Harold's name to be remembered properly and quietly. And then, when her own time came, she wanted to be placed beside Harold in the small cemetery at the edge of Cedar Hollow, where they had a plot they had bought together in 1978. Sunset Meadows Care Facility had been investigated by the Ohio Department of Aging in February, following a number of complaints that had come to light after Imani's article ran. 2 other families from Cedar Hollow and nearby towns had come forward describing similar experiences, in which family members had used powers of attorney to institutionalize elderly relatives whose property they wished to liquidate. The facility itself had not done anything illegal, strictly speaking, but the investigation had expanded to examine the broader practices of the facility's parent corporation, and several administrators had been dismissed. Brittany, the tired-looking young clerk who had smoked her cigarettes behind the kitchen dumpster, had actually called Margaret in March to thank her, saying that she had been fired for her failure to prevent Margaret's escape, but that the firing had been the best thing that had happened to her, because she had used the free time to go back to nursing school and was now halfway through an RN program. Margaret had sent her a card. Margaret sent a lot of cards now. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Margaret received a letter in the mail that she had not been expecting. It was from Ruth. Ruth, the English teacher who had recited Robert Frost to the walls at Sunset Meadows. Ruth had watched Margaret walk out of the facility on that October afternoon. Ruth, as it turned out, had been moved out of Sunset Meadows 6 weeks ago by her sister, who had heard about Margaret's story from a cousin in Columbus and who had decided that Ruth deserved a second examination of her situation. Ruth was now living with her sister in a small apartment in Akron. Ruth's letter was 4 handwritten pages. The handwriting was precise and literary and only occasionally wandered into lines of poetry. The letter said that Ruth was taking a memoir writing class at the Senior Center in Akron. Ruth said that she had decided to write a book about the year and 2 months she had spent at Sunset Meadows, a book she was calling Room 209, a book that Ruth was hoping to finish before she died. Ruth said that watching Margaret walk out of the laundry room had been the moment Ruth had decided to live longer than she had previously planned to. Ruth said that she thought Margaret should know this. Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands. She looked out the window. It had begun to snow. She read the letter a second time, then a third. Then she picked up the phone and called Clara and asked if Clara wanted to drive to Akron that weekend to visit an old teacher. On a clear blue Saturday in early December, just over a year since Margaret Ellison had walked out of Sunset Meadows, she stood on the porch of her farmhouse and watched 3 cars pull into the driveway. The first was Sam's pickup. The second was Beverly's Toyota, with Beverly at the wheel and Imani in the passenger seat. The third, a silver sedan, was David's. It was the 5th time David had come to Cedar Hollow since April. They had been building something slowly, the 2 of them. Margaret had not yet called it a reconciliation, because she was not ready to use that word, but she had begun to call it, in her private vocabulary, a conversation. A conversation that might, in time, become something else. They had come for lunch. Clara was already inside, helping Margaret with the stew. The dining room table, the new one that Margaret had bought from an estate sale in October, was set for 7. Phil Raymond was coming. So was Curtis Navarro, who had remarried in September and was bringing his new wife, Marcy. So was Wendell Obie, who had announced his retirement from Sam's Garage in November and who was celebrating the first Saturday of the rest of his life. Dolores could not come because she was in Florida visiting her grandchildren. Mike Handler could not come because Mike Handler had died in his sleep 2 weeks ago, peacefully, at 73, in his own bed, and Margaret and the foundation had paid for his funeral, which had been a small service at the Methodist church, and the grain truck had been sold to a young farmer in the next county, and Margaret had cried at the service because Mike Handler had been her husband's best fishing buddy, and because Mike Handler had driven the grain truck on 3 October nights that had changed everything, and the world was a smaller place without him. The lunch was long and loud. Beverly had brought photographs from her most recent trip to Munich. Imani had brought a printed mock-up of the book's cover, which she had just seen for the first time that week. David had brought a small wrapped gift for his mother, which turned out to be a framed print of a photograph Margaret had not seen before. Harold, at perhaps 35, standing in front of the Kaufmann barn with a hammer in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, grinning at the camera. David had found the photograph in a box he had taken from the storage unit when he had been emptying it in the summer. He had been saving it for the right moment to give her. Margaret had taken the frame and had looked at it for a long time, and then she had hung it on the kitchen wall next to the clock, and she had said nothing because there was nothing to say. After lunch, Margaret walked out to the barn with Sam, just the two of them. The afternoon light was thin and bright. There was no snow on the ground, although it had snowed the week before. The barn had been repainted in October, the weathered silver gray of its siding refreshed with a preservative stain that matched the original as closely as the conservators could match it. The new roof, installed in May, shone dully in the sun. The doors were locked but no longer padlocked. A small brass key turned a modern cylinder now, and Margaret had one, and Sam had one, and Curtis had one, and the foundation had one, and that was all. Sam unlocked the door. Margaret stepped inside. The barn was empty. The items were gone, of course, returned or stored or sold. Harold's workbench had been restored to its original 1902 configuration, with Otto Kaufmann's dovetail joints exposed and varnished. The hayloft had been cleaned and repaired. A small interpretive display had been installed along the north wall, covered for now with a cloth, waiting for the museum's opening in the spring. The floor had been swept. The air smelled like cedar in time. Margaret stood in the center of the barn and did not say anything for a long moment. Sam stood next to her. "Sam," she said eventually, "do you remember when we came in here on the first night, and I told you about the journal, and I told you about Otto?" "I remember. I remember what I thought that night. I thought, I am too old for this. I thought, I do not have the strength. I thought, I should have done this 13 years ago when I was younger, and now it is going to be harder, and I may not live to finish it." "You were going to finish it. You had already decided." "I had decided, but I did not know what deciding would feel like. I did not know that deciding to do a hard thing is the beginning of finding the strength to do it. I did not know that, Sam. I thought strength was something you had or didn't have. I thought you were born with it or not. I did not know it grew." Sam was quiet for a long time. "It grows," he said. "I have seen it grow." Margaret looked up at the hayloft. She looked at the workbench. She looked at the south wall, where Otto's hidden compartment had run for its entire length, and where, in a few months, a photograph of Otto Kaufmann would hang above an interpretive panel describing his life and his disappearance. "Harold," she said quietly, to no one and to everyone, "we did it, my love. We finished. The work is done, and the rest is somebody else's to carry." They went back to the house. The others were still at the table, laughing about something Curtis had said. David had taken off his jacket. Beverly was refilling Imani's coffee. Clara was cutting a pie. The afternoon light was slanting through the west windows and pooling on the floor in long golden rectangles. Margaret sat down at the head of the table. She had been sitting at the head of the table since October, since the first meal she had eaten in her reclaimed house. Harold had always sat at the other end. He was not there. He had not been there for 13 years. But the empty chair at the other end was not as empty as it had been in 2012, or in 2020, or in August of last year when she had been wheeled into a building with a keypad lock. The empty chair was empty now only in the way that old houses are empty, which is not really empty at all. It was full of everything that had happened in it. Margaret lifted her coffee cup. She looked around the table. She looked at Sam, who had been Harold's friend for 51 years and who had become her friend, her best friend, in the last year. She looked at Clara, who had been her friend for 50. She looked at Beverly, 29 years old now, and Imani, and Curtis and his new wife, and Phil, and Wendell, and David, who was watching his mother with a quiet, patient attention that he had not worn on his face in 30 years. She looked at them, and she felt, in her chest, a thing that she had not expected to feel at 82 years old, which was the feeling of a life that was still being lived. To Harold, she said. To Otto Kaufmann. To all the people we have carried here without knowing we were carrying them. And to all of you who have carried me this year. I could not have done this alone. I would not have wanted to. They raised their cups. To Harold, they said. To Otto. They drank. The afternoon light moved across the table. Outside, in the yard, a cardinal landed briefly on the porch rail, tilted its head, and flew away toward the big oak. In the living room, the grandfather clock struck 3, its familiar deep tone filling the house the way it had filled the house in 1978 and 1990 and 2005 and every year in between, including the years when Margaret had thought, incorrectly, that the story was mostly over. The story had not been mostly over. The story had been mostly waiting. And now, finally, the story was being lived. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.